If you lived in the Victorian era and looked healthy, congratulations, you were unattractive. In a world where most people were trying not to die of some contagious disease, fashion trends decided that the ideal look was someone who might be dying of a contagious disease, being pale, thin, and vaguely haunted by the spirits of your dead ancestors wasn't just chic, it was everything. Let's set the scene. You're a young Victorian woman, hoping to land a well-off husband. You wake up, check the mirror, and gasp in horror. What is that? Colour in your cheeks? Warmth in your face? You look healthy? No, this simply won't do. It's time to start the daily ritual of chasing the sickly siren look that said, I don't work, I don't eat, I just recline gracefully on fainting couches until someone proposes. In Victorian society, pale skin wasn't just a cosmetic preference. It was a class signal. If you had a tan, it meant you were working outdoors, probably breaking your back in a field, inhaling coal dust, or pickaxing rocks for 6p a week. If you were pale, though, that meant you were rich enough to sit inside, sip tea, and complain about the price of lace. The sun was for peasants, shade was for the elite. The whiter your skin, the further you were from physical labor, and the closer you were to snagging a husband who owned land, horses, and at least one nervous servant who had to call you ma'am, while silently judging your wallpaper choices. So women went to extremes. Parasols became more common than opinions. Giant hats with veils, gloves even in summer. And if that still didn't keep the sun off your delicate face, enter creams, powders, and homemade concoctions that would bleach you into looking like a porcelain doll or a freshly exhumed corpse. Hello travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's talk about the most unsettling trend in beauty history, consumption chic. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was one of the most feared diseases of the 19th century. It wasted the body away, drained color from your face, and gave your cheeks a feverish pink flush. Victims became rail-thin with gleaming eyes and a delicate, breathless voice. In short, they were dying, but to the Victorians, they looked gorgeous. Artists painted romanticized portraits of women in various stages of tuberculosis. Poets wrote odes to tragic, consumptive beauties. Fashion houses took notes. Pale skin, check. Dramatic eyes, check. The suggestion that you were living on a diet of ghost breath and moonlight, triple check. Young women actually tried to mimic the look of someone slowly dying. Some would rub red coloring on their cheeks to fake the flush. Others pinched their lips until they swelled with that "I've been coughing for days" hue. Thinness became an obsession. Being curvy was seen as vulgar, even immoral. You didn't want to look strong. You wanted to look like a breeze might carry you away. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about romantic tragedy. The kind of sorrowful elegance that said, I have written at least one poem about falling autumn leaves and I'm not emotionally available. If there was one thing the Victorian upper crust feared more than a lack of lace, it was looking robust. A sturdy woman with a sun-kissed glow, scandalous. She might as well have worked in the stables, or worse, walked somewhere. Exercise was suspicious. Women were actively discouraged from doing anything more strenuous than embroidery, or walking slowly in a garden while sighing dramatically. Having a constitution, Victorian code for energy, was considered vaguely unladylike. In fact, if you were a woman who could climb stairs without collapsing halfway up, society would begin to suspect you might be a witch, or worse, French. Instead, the ideal woman had the kind of fragile, quivering beauty that looked like she might shatter if you sneezed near her. Bonus points if you had a chronic illness. Better still if it was one that made your collarbones more visible. Of course, no Victorian beauty ritual would be complete without the trusty corset, a device specifically designed to squeeze you until your organs considered changing careers. A tight corset created the desired wasp waist and made you appear even more delicate. If you fainted at parties from lack of oxygen, that was just proof you were doing it right. Combined with pale skin and consumptive flair, the corset sealed the deal. You weren't just fashionable, you were a living sculpture of fragility, or at least, you were living for now. The Victorian beauty ideal was basically this. Look like you died in a poem written by a sad man. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, It was a full-on social passport, and when society demands you look like you're allergic to sunlight, have never chewed solid food and could expire by leaning too hard against a bookshelf, it's only a matter of time before someone suggests, what if we added poison? Because if you're going to suffer for beauty, why not make it fatal? By the mid-1800s, beauty wasn't just a standard, it was a business. And like all good businesses, it preyed on insecurity, packaged hope in a box, and priced it just high enough that you felt fancy but not smart. Enter one of the most charmingly lethal products the Victorian cosmetic world had to offer: Arsenic complexion wafers, the snackable skincare solution with a body count. At first glance, they didn't look like death pills. The packaging was soft and dainty, often decorated with floral scrolls or pleasant-sounding names like Dr. Rose's Arsenic complexion wafers or The Secret of Youth, which, if you think about it, is hilariously ominous. The secret of youth? Yeah, it's dying before 30. Surprise! But to the Victorian woman, desperately chasing ethereal beauty, these wafers were a miracle. Sold in tins or paper wrappers, you could purchase them over the counter at pharmacies or general stores. No questions asked. No doctor's note, no warning label. Not even a raised eyebrow from the clerk handing you literal poison with a smile. These arsenic wafers were advertised as a magical cure-all for the most dreaded beauty sins of the time: freckles, pimples, blotchy skin, or heaven forbid, visible pores. They promised to refine your complexion, even your tone, banish blemishes, and give you the ghost-like pallor of your dreams. Basically, if your skin looked like you'd recently been exhumed from a crypt, you were winning. One actual ad from the time boasted that their wafers would create skin as fair and soft as a lily petal, which sounds beautiful until you remember lilies are often associated with funerals. Coincidence? We think not. Of course, the active ingredient that did all this complexion-enhancing magic was none other than arsenic trioxide, a white, tasteless, odorless powder also used to kill rats, enemies, and occasionally your rich uncle, allegedly. But arsenic in small doses, said the marketing, was perfectly safe, even beneficial. Think of it like the 19th century version of microdosing, except, instead of unlocking creativity, you were slowly unlocking multi-organ failure. The design of these complexion wafers only added to the danger. They were small, neat, and looked suspiciously like mints, lozenges, or even pressed candies. Some had a chalky texture, like modern-day Tums. Others were sugar-coated. You were told to take them after meals, like a delicate dessert that just happened to gently rearrange your blood chemistry. Kids could have mistaken them for sweets. In fact, some probably did. And why wouldn't they? They were pastel-coloured and wrapped in ribbons. It was poison disguised as peppermint. Victorian elegance truly knew no bounds. And unlike some other period potions, which smelled like wet horse and regret, arsenic wafers had no offensive odour or taste. That was part of their appeal. They didn't burn, sting, or cause an immediate rash. The damage came slowly, quietly, like an extremely polite assassin in a ball gown. What made arsenic wafers so wildly popular was their universality. Whether you were a middle-class woman attending church socials, or a high-society debutante dodging marriage proposals, the pressure to maintain flawless skin was constant. And unlike expensive spa treatments or imported powders, wafers were accessible. Poison, but make it budget-friendly. Advertisements often featured before and after drawings. The before girl tragically freckled, her expression one of shame and singlehood. The after version, pale, poreless, and clearly engaged to a duke. There were even suggestions that the wafers would not only improve your skin, but your entire life. One ad suggested regular use would make your complexion so radiant that even strangers would remark on your beauty. Which, let's be honest, is the 19th century version of your crush will totally notice you if you use this shampoo. Victorian society had no shortage of shady miracle cures. This was the golden age of tonics, elixirs, and patent medicines, many of which were just alcohol with fancier hats. But arsenic wafers stood out because they had just enough of a visible effect to fool you. Arsenic constricts blood vessels, which can make your skin look smoother. It reduces redness. It gives you that eerie, luminous whiteness, a kind of matte finish death glow. And if you're not dropping dead immediately, you might think, hey, this is working. That's the terrifying genius of it. The effects were visible, and the consequences were delayed. You could be well into your third tin before the headaches, stomach cramps, or charming new bald spots gave away the plot twist. Arsenic wafers were beauty in a bite-sized dose. Proof that if society wants you pale and perfect badly enough, there's always someone willing to sell it to you in edible form. They were marketed with grace, sold with confidence, and consumed with the same enthusiasm we now reserve for collagen gummies and influencer-endorsed serums. The difference? Today's skincare might empty your wallet. Victorian skincare emptied your bloodstream. So next time your moisturizer stings a little, just remember, at least it's not slowly murdering your liver. Victorian beauty standards demanded results, and arsenic delivered, in the same way a freight train delivers. Swiftly, devastatingly, and with a complete disregard for your internal organs. But to understand just how much damage these dainty little wafers caused, you have to take a look inside the human body, and spoiler alert, the body was not a fan. Let's start with the basics. Arsenic is a metalloid, which is a fancy way of saying not quite a metal, but definitely something you don't want on toast. It occurs naturally in the Earth's crust, which sounds harmless enough. So does lava, and you don't smear that on your face either. Yet in small enough doses, arsenic didn't seem dangerous. In fact, it appeared to work wonders. At first, a woman taking arsenic for her complexion would notice a few changes. Her skin grew paler, seemingly smoother. Any redness, blotches, or irritation would fade. If she had freckles, they'd lighten. She might even lose a few pounds, a delightful Victorian bonus, since society had decided that eating lunch made you morally questionable. What was actually happening? Arsenic was interfering with the enzymes in her body that process energy. Cells began to suffocate, capillaries constricted, reducing blood flow to the surface of the skin, hence the eerie whiteness. Her appetite diminished because arsenic irritates the stomach lining. And that weight loss? That was her metabolism waving a white flag. But she looked amazing, ethereal, delicate, like someone who never did chores because she physically couldn't. And in Victorian society, that meant she was winning. Of course, beauty has its price. And with arsenic, the bill came due quickly. After prolonged use, even modest doses began to pile up. Arsenic is a cumulative poison, meaning the body doesn't efficiently get rid of it. It stores it, like a toxic savings account. Every wafer, every tonic, every sweet little dose added up until your insides were holding a tea party in a toxic waste dump. This is when things got unpleasant. Users might begin experiencing persistent nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and mysterious rashes. Hair could start falling out. Fingernails would develop white horizontal lines, called Mises lines, a telltale sign of arsenic poisoning. And then came the abdominal cramping, the vomiting, the diarrhea, all of it charmingly ignored in ads, which continued to suggest you'd be the belle of the ball, not the ghost in the lavatory. And the worst part? Many users kept going, because they looked in the mirror and saw flawless skin. Because society told them beauty mattered more than comfort, more than health, and more than basic bodily dignity. Then there were those who either took too much or had been microdosing their way into oblivion for too long. That's when arsenic stopped flirting with death and went for a full relationship. Larger doses of arsenic trigger multi-organ failure. It starts with the gastrointestinal tract. Extreme vomiting, uncontrollable diarrhea, and dehydration that leaves you looking like a sun-dried raisin with excellent cheekbones. Then your liver and kidneys begin to shut down. Blood pressure drops. The nervous system gets involved. Your hands and feet burn. You might hallucinate, go into convulsions, or fall into a coma. Doctors at the time didn't always recognize the signs. After all, arsenic poisoning mimics cholera, food poisoning, or just being very, very Victorian. But if they'd had modern toxicology reports, they'd have seen a trail of damage written in chemical chaos. Mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, disrupted metabolism. Basically, your entire internal operation went on strike, while your face continued to glow like a porcelain lamp. And the final kicker? You might not even die immediately. Arsenic could take days to kill you. Or, if you were on the slow poison regimen as many beauty seekers were, you could deteriorate for months. Your symptoms would ebb and flow. You'd recover slightly, just enough to think you were getting better, right before your body made its final exit. Here's the kicker. The very symptoms of poisoning could reinforce the illusion of beauty. Pale? Yes. Because your blood vessels were shriveling. Thinner? Absolutely. Because you couldn't keep down a biscuit. Glossy-eyed and dazed? Of course, because your brain was slowly drowning in neurotoxins. The Victorian glow wasn't metaphorical. It was the physical manifestation of your blood cells going, "Ma'am, we're dying." One medical journal at the time noted that long-term arsenic users developed a waxen, luminous sheen, which sounds like something you'd want in a scented candle, not a living person. And yet, the wafers kept selling. Arsenic earned its nickname, the king of poisons, not because it killed the fastest, but because it killed with style. It made you look great, until it didn't. It turned your body into a beautifully wrapped death trap. And in a society that worshipped fragility and praised paleness, it was the perfect poison. Slow, subtle, and aesthetically pleasing. It gave you that Victorian glow, mostly because your blood was screaming internally. If you thought popping a few arsenic-laced beauty wafers was extreme, then buckle up, because the Victorians didn't stop at skin-deep poison. No, in true 19th century fashion, they went all in. Arsenic wasn't just dabbed on the face anymore. It was swallowed, sipped, and swallowed again, all in the name of looking good and feeling vaguely invincible. Welcome to the arsenic diet, where your weight might go down, your complexion might glow, and your internal organs quietly began their slow descent into panic. By the mid-1800s, arsenic had made the leap from dangerous household poison to miracle wellness ingredient. It started appearing in tonics, pills, drops, and even mineral waters, touted as the solution to a laundry list of first-world 19th century problems: low energy, dull skin, extra weight, low spirits, bad breath, and generally being alive in Victorian society. These remedies weren't just for women, either. Men took them too, to feel stronger, more virile, and less like they were slowly dying from overtight collars and untreated syphilis. Arsenic promised a pick-me-up that tea couldn't touch. You could walk taller, breathe easier, and maybe even climb a hill without collapsing like a gothic novel character. And naturally, none of these arsenic-filled products were regulated. No testing, no approval process, no ingredient breakdown. You just took your poison like a good consumer and hoped for the best. Advertisers had a field day. One tonic claimed to invigorate the spirit, lighten the limbs, and stimulate the appetite, which is hilarious, considering one of arsenic's most consistent effects was making your appetite vanish like a Victorian child's inheritance in a Dickens novel. But the Victorian elite weren't the first to dabble in arsenic wellness. For that honour, we must travel east to the rural mountains of Austria, Hungary, where a peculiar group of people were doing something that absolutely terrified doctors. They were eating arsenic on purpose and thriving. These folks, dubbed the arsenic eaters, became a scientific curiosity in the 19th century. Farmers and hunters in alpine villages were reported to chew chunks of white arsenic or mix it with animal fat and swallow it regularly, claiming it gave them increased stamina, better skin, and the ability to climb steep mountain slopes like goats on Red Bull. According to reports, they didn't suffer any noticeable ill effects. In fact, they looked great. Glossy hair, strong muscles, glowing complexions. They were basically the influencers of their time, except, instead of sponsored Instagram posts, they had suspiciously well-functioning lungs and a bottle of something toxic in their pocket. Doctors were baffled. Scientists tried to replicate the effect and failed. The conclusion? The arsenic eaters had built up a unique tolerance, likely through gradual exposure over years. They were an evolutionary anomaly, or, as Victorian physicians put it, probably sorcery. But once news spread, the arsenic diet craze gained traction. If rugged Austrian mountain men could do it, why couldn't a slightly anemic London socialite? The logic was deeply Victorian. If it doesn't kill you, it must be fashionable. One of the arsenic diet's biggest selling points was its miraculous ability to shed weight. In an era obsessed with slim, fragile figures, especially for women, this was a game changer. You didn't need to exercise, which was considered unladylike anyway. And you didn't have to skip cake at tea, although arsenic usually made you so nauseous, you skipped everything. You just took your dose, smiled through the stomach cramps, and watched as your waistline shrank, your appetite died, and your friends all said, "You look so pale and elegant. What's your secret?" You couldn't exactly answer, "I'm microdosing pest control," so you probably just smiled enigmatically. and pretended you were born with it. Like arsenic was your personal brand of divine suffering. And the beauty of it all, the results came before the consequences. You got the glow, the thinness, the energy spike, all before the vomiting, liver damage and creeping paranoia set in. Of course, as with all great wellness fads, the arsenic diet came with a hidden cost, death, or, at the very least, very creative suffering. People who misjudged their dose, and it didn't take much, could find themselves violently ill within hours. Organ failure, neurological symptoms, convulsions, and bloody stool weren't in the ad copy, but there were frequent side effects, and there were the accidental deaths too, children getting into the pills, curious husbands trying their wife's tonic, dogs licking up the residue. Arsenic didn't care who you were, it just wanted in. Still, the trend held on, because beauty, as the Victorians saw it, was supposed to come with suffering. If you weren't fainting, restricting, squeezing, or subtly dying, were you even trying? The arsenic diet was the 1800s version of the juice cleanse, except instead of clearing out toxins, it added them directly to your bloodstream. It was sold as invigorating, elegant, and ever so slightly rebellious, a shortcut to perfection, a quiet rebellion against mortality and digestion. It was the original detox, except instead of flushing your system, it just flushed your life expectancy. In modern times, when makeup causes a breakout, we angrily toss it in a drawer, post a bad review, and swear off the brand forever until the next sale. In Victorian times, when makeup caused breakouts, blindness, or the occasional organ failure, the response was more like, "Ah yes, but my cheekbones have never looked better." Because if there's one thing Victorian beauty standards excelled at, it was weaponizing vanity. And nowhere was that more evident than in the world of cosmetics. A glamorous death trap disguised in lace-trimmed packaging. Let's begin with face powder. A staple in every beauty kit from pauper to princess. If you were pale, you were desirable. If you were powdered, you were serious about it. But this wasn't your average cornstarch and silk blend. This was lead-based powder, often called Venetian ceruse, or painted death, if you were being honest about it. Victorian women applied it generously, all over the face, neck, chest, and sometimes even their arms. It provided a flawless porcelain finish, concealed blemishes, and had the added benefit of gently poisoning you through your pores. Lead interferes with neurological function, destroys red blood cells, and oh yeah, causes hair loss and skin rot, which is just about the opposite of what you'd want from a beauty product. But the truly devilish part, the worse your skin got, the more powder you had to apply to cover it up. Congratulations. You've entered the world's most fashionable toxic feedback loop. You know that radiant, glassy-eyed look that's so popular in romantic literature. Victorians wanted it in real life, so they turned to mercury-based eye drops, which made the eyes look larger, wetter, and more dramatically expressive. It worked, for a time. Mercury inflames the eye's surface and dilates the pupils, giving that wide-eyed, haunted orphan glow. But prolonged use could lead to permanent eye damage, sensitivity to light, and in extreme cases, total blindness. One wrong drop, and you weren't just weeping romantically, you were weeping mercury. Still, for a fleeting moment, you looked like a tragic heroine staring wistfully into the moors. Was it worth it? According to Victorian logic, absolutely. And speaking of eye enhancement, let's talk about belladonna, a charmingly fatal plant, also known as deadly nightshade. Women dripped its extract into their eyes to achieve those big, dilated pupils that screamed, "I'm mysterious, romantic, and possibly dying." The name belladonna literally means beautiful woman in Italian, because nothing says beauty like a neurotoxin. The drops worked by paralyzing the eye muscles, forcing the pupils wide open and making the user appear more seductive. Of course, belladonna also caused blurred vision, hallucinations, rapid heartbeat, and if used too often, total loss of eyesight. So while you couldn't quite see your reflection in the mirror, you could be confident that it looked absolutely breathtaking. Now, what's a porcelain white face without a pop of color? Enter rouge, usually made from ingredients like cinnabar, mercury sulfide, carmine crushed bugs, or cochineal beetles, sometimes mixed with grease, lead, and ammonia for texture and shine. Rouge was applied in 2 symmetrical dots on the cheeks. Think blush, but with a tendency to give you chemical burns and cystic acne. And yet, The goal was not to appear healthy, but rather to appear like you were fading slowly from a broken heart and maybe consumption. One popular recipe even contained vermilion, a vivid red pigment that could cause skin peeling, headaches, and liver damage. But hey, the redness was symmetrical, and that's what mattered. Lips needed attention too, and guess what? More lid. Lip tints and stains often contained red lid or carmine, sometimes blended with coal tar for that dramatic hue. It gave lips a deep, romantic color right before eating away at the skin underneath. There were even homemade recipes involving vinegar, rust, and rose petals, a DIY nightmare that produced lips that looked less like a love letter and more like a medical emergency. But as long as you were kissed by death figuratively or literally, you were on trend. All of this begs the question, why didn't anyone stop to think maybe makeup shouldn't make you blind, bald, or buried? The answer: because the illusion of beauty was more important than the reality of health. Makeup wasn't just about looking good. It was about signaling wealth, class, femininity, and emotional fragility. If you could endure mercury tears and a lead rash while still sipping tea gracefully, society applauded your efforts. To suffer elegantly was the height of sophistication. And as for the medical community, many doctors of the era believed women were too emotional to handle the truth, so warnings were soft-pedaled or dismissed entirely. Besides, they had their own issues to worry about, like prescribing cocaine for toothaches and lobotomies for boredom. So yes, Victorian makeup was essentially a portable chemistry set, and the experiment was always, what if I die pretty? Between the powders, drops, rouges, and tints, every cosmetic routine was a roll of the dice, except the dice were loaded with toxins, and the prize was looking like a porcelain doll one rash away from the grave. It was beauty by any means necessary, even if those means included eye-numbing poison, mercury lash sauce, and powdered facial death. In the modern world, we take a certain comfort in seeing doctor recommended on a product. Toothpaste, vitamin supplements, overpriced memory foam. It's supposed to mean someone with a stethoscope gave it the thumbs up. But back in the Victorian era, the phrase doctor recommended meant a whole lot less and hurt a whole lot more. Because if you were a woman in the 19th century, trying to survive the brutal standards of fashion and femininity, chances are the person handing you poison with a pleasant nod was not a snake oil salesman, it was your actual doctor. Let's begin with a dose of tragic irony. Victorian doctors didn't just tolerate arsenic and other poisons, they endorsed them. In many cases, they were the ones prescribing it. For what, you ask? Just a few minor conditions like fainting spells, skin deficiencies, digestive complaints, chronic fatigue, nervous energy, which was 1800s code for you're a woman having feelings, and of course the big one, cosmetic enhancement. Doctors of the time would happily prescribe arsenic pills for improving complexion, and some even claimed it helped stimulate the blood or refine the nerves, which sure it did. In the same way a jackhammer refines pavement. Want to lose weight? Arsenic. Want to look younger? Arsenic. Want to feel more energetic? You guessed it. Arsenic? It was the prescription for everything, except maybe actual health. And they didn't stop there. Need to shrink those pesky under-eye bags? How about a mercury salve? Acne scars? Try a light acid bath. Can't sleep? Opium. Still can't sleep? Add some cocaine to your opium. Feeling too sleepy? A shot of strychnine should perk you up. Nothing screams trustworthy like a guy with a mustache and zero understanding of internal organs. You have to remember, this was before the concept of medical regulation really existed. There was no FDA, no standardized testing, no requirement to prove a treatment worked, or say, wouldn't liquefy your kidneys. Medical science at the time was 1/3 genuine discovery, 1/3 enthusiastic guesswork, and 1/3 make it up and say it louder than the competition. If you had a title like doctor, people assumed you knew what you were doing, even if your version of a checkup was staring at someone's tongue and then offering them a small box of poison with a confident flourish. Physicians often relied on anecdotal evidence, meaning if 3 rich women said they felt better after drinking diluted arsenic, that was considered solid medical data. Double-blind studies? Not a thing. Clinical trials? Also not a thing. She looks less sad and slightly glowy was basically peer-reviewed science. Now, not all Victorian doctors were complete frauds. Some truly wanted to help their patients. They were just working in a time when medicine was about as advanced as your cousin's essential oil MLM. But others, they were pure opportunists. They wrote books and pamphlets promoting dangerous beauty practices. One particularly infamous doctor published a guide recommending arsenic as part of a young lady's daily skincare regimen, right next to lemon juice and rosewater, as though it weren't also used to kill rats in the same household. Another claimed that daily mercury applications brightened the eyes and cleansed the soul, which sounds nice until you remember mercury also brightens your autopsy report. These weren't back-alley figures either. Some had royal clientele. Others were respected by upper-class society. They wore cravats. They had waiting rooms. They used words like humours and vapours, and carried little silver instruments that made them look professional while prescribing liquid metal to a 17-year-old debutante with anxiety and freckles. Because there was no central oversight, anyone with a certificate, or in some cases, a really convincing accent, could start treating patients. Medical schools varied wildly in quality. Licensing was inconsistent, and even legitimate doctors were often just guessing with more Latin. This left the door wide open for patent medicines, commercial tonics and treatments, often endorsed by physicians, that were completely unregulated. Many were labelled with names like Dr. Chatterby's invigorating tonic, or Madame Pruitt's complexion cure, and proudly advertised their contents: arsenic, mercury, laudanum, chloroform, cocaine. Basically, everything you'd find in a haunted pharmacy. And because women were often dismissed by doctors as hysterical, they were frequently told to take more, not less, of these toxic treatments. After all, if you were pale, anxious, and dizzy, it wasn't because you were poisoned. It was just the natural state of being female in Victorian society. In the Victorian world, your doctor was a man with a monocle, a medical bag, and absolutely no fear of giving you poison in a decorative bottle. The blind trust people placed in their physicians, combined with a total lack of regulation, created a perfect storm for beauty-based suffering. And so, in a time when the best medical minds still debated whether bad air caused disease, arsenic was more than a beauty hack, it was a prescription. So the next time you complain about healthcare today, remember at least your dermatologist isn't offering you a mercury-based concealer and saying, "Take 2, and call me if your teeth fall out." It's easy to assume that arsenic wafers just slipped into society like a deadly whisper, quiet, insidious, and vaguely medical. But no, arsenic was sold, hard, with glittering promises, flowery fonts, and just the right shade of guilt. In fact, the true genius behind the arsenic skincare trend wasn't the science, there wasn't any. It was the marketing, a masterclass in making women crave poison by wrapping it in lace and aspiration. Why sell snake oil when you can sell snake venom in a cute pink tin? The marketing model was brilliantly cruel and depressingly timeless. Remind people what's wrong with them, then offer the fix for a price. Victorian women were already bombarded with impossible standards. They were expected to be flawless but effortless, pale but not sickly, unless it was romantic, thin but not coarse, elegant but obedient. In other words, beautiful but also completely made up and emotionally convenient. Enter the arsenic wafer, hand-delivered to the heart of these insecurities. Advertisements promised women they could perfect themselves, smooth their skin, remove unsightly freckles, and achieve that rare porcelain glow that practically screamed, "I've never worked a day in my life." These ads didn't just promote a product, they promoted a fantasy. If you bought this tin, you weren't just improving your skin, you were improving your entire future. Much of the marketing was laced, sometimes literally, with marital subtext. In a time when a woman's social and financial stability depended heavily on marriage, looking good wasn't about self-esteem, it was about survival. If your skin wasn't soft enough, or your complexion not pale enough, your odds of securing a well-positioned husband dropped faster than your white blood cell count. Arsenic wafers were positioned as the elegant shortcut. Want to stand out at your debutante ball? Want the baron to notice you? Want to finally get the attention of that gentleman who's only ever spoken to your sister because her cheeks don't have freckles? Arsenic could help. Magazines ran full-page spreads, promising women that with just a few months of daily wafer use, they'd be radiant, refined, and romantically irresistible. Who wouldn't want that? Sure, you might also be anemic and slightly hallucinatory, but priorities. The design of these products was all part of the act. The packaging was deliberately soft, sweet, and feminine. Tins were painted with floral patterns. Product names included words like lily, pearl, velvet, and bloom. Some even used fake French, because nothing says high-end luxury like misspelled Parisian nonsense. It wasn't enough to promise beauty, you had to sell elegance, and that meant poison disguised as perfume. Something you could leave on your vanity without embarrassment. Something you could proudly display when your cousin visited, whispering with envy about how well you were looking lately. And it worked. Victorians weren't idiots. They knew arsenic had a reputation, but marketing reframed it. It wasn't poison, it was a refined tonic, a complexion aid, a feminine enhancer, like calling a guillotine a chin elevator. One of the greatest tools in the toxic beauty marketer's arsenal was the women's magazine. These publications were like the 19th century version of beauty influencers, complete with advice columns, etiquette tips, and glowing reviews of the latest products. And guess what kind of product they loved reviewing? That's right, arsenic wafers. Articles praised the wafers for producing delicate, fairy-like beauty, with just a hint of shyness and death. Testimonials filled the pages. After using Madame Sylvia's wafers, my husband said I looked 10 years younger, or I've never been more confident, and my neighbors have noticed. Some magazines even published pseudo-scientific breakdowns of how arsenic purified the blood or neutralized excessive bile, which sounds made up because it was, but readers believed it because it came in the same publication that told you which gloves were appropriate for mourning and how not to offend your governess. What's truly insidious is how the marketing of these products weaponized class insecurity. Pale skin wasn't just pretty, it was a marker of status. Only women of wealth could afford to stay out of the sun, to indulge in self-care, to spend their time fading into dainty uselessness. So arsenic wafers became aspirational. A servant girl could look like a duchess. A middle-class woman could trick high society. These products didn't just promise beauty, they promised upward mobility. For the cost of a small tin, you could fake your way into looking like someone who had nothing better to do than write melancholy poetry and occasionally cough delicately into lace. And that illusion? It sold by the crate. Arsenic wafers weren't just popular because they worked in the worst possible way. They were popular because they were perfectly marketed. They tapped into every insecurity, every societal pressure, every whispered fear of aging, poverty, or spinsterhood. They made women feel like they were taking control, even as they were slowly losing control of their immune system. And the people selling them? They weren't wearing lab coats, they were wearing top hats, counting profits, and rolling out the next product line of pastel packaged poison, with a wink and a well-timed testimonial. Because in Victorian England, beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was deeply profitable. The ads promised radiance, the tins whispered elegance, the doctors gave an approving nod. But behind the powdery curtains of Victorian beauty was a truth you wouldn't find in any magazine spread. People were falling apart, literally. Welcome to the part of the story they didn't print on the packaging, because may cause hair loss, hallucinations, and organ liquefaction. Doesn't look great in cursive. One of the most immediate and obvious side effects of arsenic use, whether applied, swallowed, or sneakily baked into your beauty biscuits, was hair loss. Victorian women would wake up to brushes full of their once prized locks. Not just thinning. We're talking sudden bald patches that no bonnet could fix. Eyebrows and eyelashes fell out too. Combine that with dilated pupils and pale, waxy skin, and you looked less like a fashionable lady and more like a haunted doll left out in the rain. But did this stop users? Nope. Many simply chalked it up to stress, the weather, or a touch of the melancholia. One woman wrote to a beauty column in 1879 complaining that she could no longer wear her favourite updo because her scalp resembled a sickly parsnip, but ended the letter with, "Still, my freckles are almost gone, I persist." Nothing says commitment to skincare like ignoring the fact your scalp is staging a rebellion. The goal of arsenic wafers was to create smooth, pale skin, but the longer you used them, the more your skin started looking like a Victorian war zone. Women reported peeling, rashes, boils, and ulcers. One poor soul in Leeds described her cheeks as soft as porcelain and just as cracked. Another wrote that her face shone like wax in candlelight, which would have been poetic if she hadn't followed it with, "Though my chin now bleeds when I smile." A London dressmaker named Eliza Raw was so determined to erase a lifelong sunspot that she doubled her wafer dose. It worked. The spot disappeared, and so did a coin-sized portion of her cheek, which she then covered with strategic ribbon placement and an endless supply of powdered lies. It was the skincare equivalent of trying to fix a squeaky door by removing the door entirely. We've talked a lot about what happened to the outside, but inside, things were way worse. Arsenic users frequently suffered chronic fatigue, digestive issues, blurred vision, and muscle weakness. One aristocrat reportedly had to be carried upstairs after dinner every night due to mystery ailments. Turns out her mystery was slow-motion organ failure, sponsored by beauty wafers. But the really tragic part, many didn't connect their symptoms to the product. It was so normalized, so elegant, that people blamed anything but the arsenic. Bad water, poor digestion, ghosts. Anything but the fact that they were eating a known pesticide to impress a society that thought tuberculosis was chic. Victorian advice columns were full of letters from women, desperate to know, why do I feel awful, but look fantastic? Take this real and harrowing example. A woman from Edinburgh wrote that, while her complexion had cleared to a milky glow, she now experienced dull aches in the limbs, fits of trembling, and occasional bleeding of the gums. The columnist replied, "Reduce your dosage and ensure you are not taking wafers during menses. Beauty should not come at the price of one's cheer." One suspects that woman was bleeding from more than just her gums shortly thereafter. There were also tales of strange growths, fingernails detaching, and even one case of a woman whose teeth began to loosen and fall out during a dinner party. According to her sister, she smiled graciously until a molar dropped into the soup. The dinner continued. Of course it did. One of the most chilling aspects of these stories isn't just the physical deterioration, it's the emotional loyalty. Even as women suffered, many continued using the wafers because the fear of social failure outweighed the fear of actual death. Marriage, status, approval, these things were more urgent than liver function. Arsenic had become not just a beauty product, but a symbol of aspiration. To stop using it meant admitting that beauty had limits, or worse, that your skin might have to exist naturally in public. One particularly heartbreaking account comes from a young woman whose mother had used arsenic wafers for most of her adult life. On her deathbed, jaundiced, weak, and nearly blind, the mother grasped her daughter's hand and whispered, "Never let them see you red-faced." Legacy, it seems, came with a body count. In the end, the side effects weren't mysterious. They were just conveniently ignored. Arsenic users weren't rare cases or cautionary tales whispered after dinner. They were your neighbor, your sister, your hairdresser, your governess, and many of them looked stunning, until they coughed up a chunk of spleen at the dinner table. For decades, arsenic was the crown jewel of the Victorian beauty routine. It promised flawlessness, whispered elegance, and delivered, well, a slow, glittering death. But like every fashion trend that goes a little too far, powdered wigs, lead corsets, boy bands, eventually, the world begins to wake up. By the late 19th century, cracks began to show in arsenic's porcelain perfect image, not just in cheekbones or digestive tracts, but in public opinion, medical science, and legal oversight. Because it turns out, glowing skin is less attractive when it's due to radiation-level toxicity. One of the biggest reasons arsenic started losing its status as a beauty staple was the rise of actual science. The late 1800s saw a slow but steady shift from medical quackery to real, evidence-based practices. Germ theory became the hot new trend. Microscopes stopped being mere paperweights, and doctors started realizing that tired all the time, with sudden organ failure, might actually not be a sign of refined womanhood. Researchers began publishing articles warning about the dangers of cumulative poisons. Lab testing revealed that popular wafers and tonics were loaded with lethal doses. Even those claiming just a pinch of arsenic were delivering enough to turn your liver into a decorative sponge. Physiologists noted that women using arsenic over time developed symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning, nausea, neural degeneration, and in some cases, death that looked suspiciously fashionable. The more doctors understood the human body, the harder it became to pretend that maybe arsenic was just misunderstood, like a brooding poet who happened to kill everyone he dated. Nothing ruins a marketing campaign quite like dead customers. As more high-profile cases of arsenic poisoning surfaced, it became harder for society to dismiss them as coincidences or unrelated fainting spells. There were newspaper stories of young women collapsing at parties, fainting in public gardens, or dying in their sleep at the horrifying age of 24, all while looking positively angelic. Inquests began digging deeper, literally, and autopsies revealed arsenic in their systems, in shocking amounts. One scandal involved a young heiress whose funeral was barely over before the local coroner published a report titled, "The Glow That Killed Her." Suddenly, society started whispering a new tune. Maybe beauty shouldn't be fatal. This growing unease created a wave of bad publicity for arsenic-based products. Testimonials that once claimed "my skin has never looked better" were starting to read more like "her skin never looked better, and now she's buried in it." As with all long-standing public health disasters, the downfall wasn't just triggered by science. It was fueled by lawsuits, scandals, and righteous indignation. Consumers began suing beauty companies, claiming that their products caused disfigurement, illness, or death. Families of deceased young women started demanding answers. Activists and women's rights advocates began pointing out the deeply sexist double standard of pushing lethal expectations under the guise of grace. One particularly scandalous case involved a famous actress whose maid testified that the performer had been shaking, vomiting, and bleeding from her gums for weeks, all while taking Miss Genevieve's enchanted skin drops. When the drops were analyzed, they contained enough arsenic to kill a small horse, twice. The ensuing trial was covered in detail by the press, and for the first time the phrase "arsenic beauty tonic" was no longer associated with grace, but with graves. Manufacturers panicked. Some tried rebranding, changing the name from arsenic to white mineral extract. Others slapped on vague labels like refined complexion salts, and hoped no one noticed their customers were glowing and missing teeth. It didn't work. By the early 1900s, the clamour for change had reached Parliament, where lawmakers who had previously shrugged off the issue finally realised that dead daughters made for very angry voters. Britain, along with several other nations, began pushing for regulation. Arsenic was slowly reclassified from a beauty aid to a controlled substance. Products were required to list ingredients. Labels had to include warnings, and eventually, many arsenic-based tonics were pulled from the shelves entirely. In the US, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act kicked off the same process, banning unregulated sales of poisonous health products. The era of slap anything in a tin and call it radiance was officially over. Well, mostly. Beyond regulation, there was also a profound shift in cultural thinking. For the first time, people began asking a radical question. What if beauty didn't have to hurt? The rise of suffrage, better education, and the slow, reluctant awakening of medical ethics meant that women started rejecting the idea that looking good should come at the cost of personal safety or internal bleeding. And slowly but surely, the definition of beauty evolved, still problematic in many ways, yes, but less likely to kill you via skincare. Arsenic didn't vanish overnight, but its reputation certainly did. What was once considered a mark of refinement became a red flag of ignorance, vanity, or poor medical advice. The tins lost their luster, the wafers disappeared, and society finally admitted, maybe glowing isn't glamorous, if it means your pancreas is glowing too. Turns out, looking like a marble statue isn't worth it if you end up as one in the cemetery. So, arsenic wafers are gone. The pastel tins have rusted shut. No one's smearing lid on their face in the name of elegance anymore, right? Well, don't breathe that sigh of relief just yet, because while we've mostly stopped eating literal poison in the name of flawless skin, the ghost of Victorian beauty culture is still very much haunting our modern bathroom cabinets. Arsenic may be out of fashion, but its seductive promise, the idea that suffering equals beauty, is very much alive and wearing a $300 sheet mask made of snail slime. Today we just pay $300 for a facial that burns our skin legally. Progress. Modern beauty marketing isn't that different from what the arsenic salesmen were peddling in the 1800s. The names have changed. Complexion wafers are now collagen boosters, tonics are now glow elixirs, and instead of arsenic, we flirt with things like retinol burns, peel-induced trauma, and the delightful sting of chemical exfoliation. Sure, the science is more advanced, but the psychology? Practically identical. You're still being told there's something wrong with you. Too red, too dark, too old, too human. and offered a miracle fix in a jar that costs more than your electricity bill. Instead of mail-order poisons, we now get customized skincare quizzes that recommend 13-step routines designed to rewire your skin DNA, a phrase that's both medically meaningless and terrifyingly expensive. We may laugh at Victorian women smearing their faces with arsenic, but let's talk about modern toxic beauty habits. Tanning beds, essentially microwaves for your skin, still used despite decades of links to skin cancer. Skin bleaching creams, many of which are banned in multiple countries due to mercury content, but still fly off shelves in others. DIY skincare hacks involving lemon juice, glue and toothpaste, because nothing says dermatologist approved like using kitchen condiments to unclog your pores. And let's not forget the rise of injectables, acids, vampire facials, snail mucus, bee venom, and placenta creams. Is any of it harmful? Maybe not, but is it a little weird that we're still willing to smear questionable substances on our faces in the name of youth? You bet your collagen it is. The Victorian woman had magazines and marriage markets, whispering insecurities into her powdered ears. Today, we have Instagram, TikTok, filters, Facetune, and a never-ending scroll of influencers whose job is to look like they've never had a skin cell out of place. Victorian arsenic users had society breathing down their necks. We have algorithms. Now, instead of being told you need to look like a consumptive duchess, you're told to have glass skin, cloudless skin, or the skin of a fetus that's never encountered sunlight. Oh, and you need to achieve this by next Tuesday, preferably with a product from a celebrity's skincare line that sounds like a spa treatment and a moon phase had a baby. And if you dare to have a wrinkle, a spot, a pore, don't worry, there's a filter for that, or 12. It's still the same emotional squeeze. If you're not beautiful enough, you're not lovable, successful, or worthy. The Victorian ghost claps slowly from the mirror. The biggest lesson the arsenic era left us is this: when pain becomes fashionable, everyone suffers, but prettily. Victorian women weren't stupid or vain. They were simply responding to a society that told them they were only valuable if they looked a certain way. Sound familiar? Today's beauty standards may be more inclusive on paper, but the bar just keeps moving. We're supposed to be effortlessly glowing, naturally enhanced, and meticulously casual. You know, just like everyone else who spent 2 hours contouring and has a team of dermatologists on speed dial. The danger isn't always in the product. It's in the belief that beauty is a test you must pass, no matter the cost. Whether it's a wafer of arsenic or a $450 oxygen infusion, it's still the same game. Fix yourself or risk invisibility. But let's not end this saga entirely in despair, because there are signs of progress. We now have regulations. Ingredients are tested. People ask questions. The phrase clean beauty exists. Even if it's mostly a marketing gimmick, there's more awareness, more dermatologists on YouTube, and way fewer spleens being coughed up at formal dinners. Movements toward body positivity, authenticity, and self-care without self-destruction are gaining momentum. Some people are even embracing their skin, pores, freckles and all, and saying, you know what, I'm good. That wouldn't have just been revolutionary in the Victorian era. It might have been considered witchcraft. Arsenic wafers may be gone, but the world still whispers the same old temptations. Look better, younger, lighter, smoother. But now we know how that story ends. So the next time you're tempted by a product that promises transformation, just remember, once upon a time, that promise came in a dainty little tin filled with poison. And while the packaging has changed, the best beauty rule still applies. If it burns, bleeds, blinds, or boils, maybe don't put it on your face. Let's talk about the creation of the post office. Before inboxes and delivery vans, before stamps and sorting facilities, there were just feet, sometimes horses, sometimes camels, but mostly feet, tired, blistered, probably smelly feet. Ancient civilizations didn't have the luxury of texting you up across vast empires. No, if you wanted to deliver a message in, say, 3000 BCE, you had to either carve it into a rock and pray someone picked it up, or tie it to a courier and hope he didn't get eaten by wolves, fall into a river, or just decide he was tired of this job and become a goat farmer instead. Let's start in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and apparently the land of constant memo writing. The Sumerians were the first people to truly weaponize bureaucracy. They invented cuneiform around 3200 BCE, because shouting across the marketplace just wasn't cutting it anymore, and started scribbling their business dealings onto clay tablets. These tablets were then baked into little postal bricks and handed off to messengers. No envelopes, no stamps, just a guy holding what looked like a gluten-free granola bar covered in wedge-shaped scribbles. The job of a messenger was not glamorous. You weren't getting hazard pay. You were a glorified human pigeon, hauling a 4-pound dirt letter from one city-state to another, while avoiding thieves, wild animals, and heat stroke. But hey, at least there wasn't email back then. You couldn't be CC'd on 24 different complaints from your boss about late grain shipments. Now head southwest to ancient Egypt, where pharaohs ruled with eyeliner gold and an undying love of papyrus. Egyptians weren't huge on clay. They preferred their writing surface a bit more flammable. Papyrus scrolls were the preferred medium, especially for official decrees and tax notices, which means, yes, ancient Egypt had its own version of junk mail. Scribes would carefully pen orders from the pharaoh, roll the scrolls up like royal burritos, and hand them to specialized couriers, often chosen for speed, loyalty, and the ability to not die in the desert. These mail runners would traverse the Nile or sprint across sandy roads, occasionally hitching a ride with boats or donkeys, but mostly relying on their own 2 legs and a very strong bladder. And let's be clear, being a courier in Egypt wasn't just a job, it was a cardiovascular event, with 0 postal unions and a delivery route that included crocodile-infested waters and 100 degrees Fahrenheit heat. It was less rain, sleet, and snow, and more scorching sun, sand in your sandals, and also, here's a snake. Meanwhile, over in ancient China, they were figuring things out in a way that only a civilization covering thousands of miles could. The early Chinese dynasties understood that yelling messages across an empire the size of modern-day Europe wasn't scalable, and neither was hoping some traveler would casually carry a letter from Beijing to the other side of the continent. So the Chinese government developed a courier system that would evolve into one of the most sophisticated postal networks of the ancient world. By the time of the Zhou dynasty, around 1000 BCE, they had established official relay stations, strategically placed posts where couriers could rest, change horses, or just not die. These stations were called ye, and they allowed information to travel surprisingly quickly across massive distances. Of course, quickly is relative. You might still be waiting a week for that scroll from your cousin who moved to the northern frontier to try farming and now just writes you to complain about yegs. But in ancient terms, it was blazing fast. Plus, messages were written on bamboo strips tied together with string, a kind of text-based fidget toy that also doubled as government propaganda. But the absolute champion of ancient postal innovation was the Persian Empire, who ran what may have been the first professional empire-wide postal service, the Angarium. Created by the Achaemenid king Darius I around 500 BCE, the Angarium was a system of mounted couriers who could deliver messages across the empire faster than you could say, "Please don't invade Greece." The Angarium used a network of roads, especially the Royal Road, which stretched over 1,500 miles from Sardis to Susa. Along the route were relay stations where couriers could swap horses, rest and pick up snacks. Or, let's be honest, possibly just another royal proclamation about how taxes were going up again. Herodotus, the Greek historian and part-time drama king, even wrote about these messengers with admiration. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Sound familiar? That line's been borrowed by the US Postal Service, even though they now have to deal more with Amazon boxes than imperial scrolls. And unlike many systems of the time, the Angarium wasn't just for the king and his top advisors. Well, okay, yes, mostly it was for them, but it still showed the world that communication over long distances could be standardized, streamlined, and done in a way that didn't involve yelling over city walls or hiring your cousin who couldn't hold a job. These early systems weren't perfect. Messages got lost, couriers went missing, scrolls caught fire or got eaten by camels, but they laid the foundation for what would eventually become the global information highway, one dusty sandal print at a time. The Romans are known for many things: roads, aqueducts, tugas that left one shoulder cold, and stabbing Julius Caesar with more enthusiasm than a Black Friday sale. But among their lesser-sung achievements was a delivery system that was faster, more organized, and occasionally more dramatic than a Netflix customer service call. The Cursus Publicus, Rome's state-run courier service, established by Emperor Augustus, because after assassinations and civil war, he decided maybe it was time to get the paperwork in order. The Cursus Publicus was designed to carry official imperial correspondence across the sprawling, sandal-scorched Roman Empire, from the wind-swept hills of Britannia to the date palm oases of Egypt. If Rome had a governor sitting in a marble chair nervously sipping watered-down wine, chances are he needed updates from headquarters, and not just about taxes, although mostly about taxes. Augustus, with his usual flair for micromanaging the known world, knew that if an empire was going to function across thousands of miles, you couldn't just rely on gossip, pigeons, or screaming across the Alps. So he created a courier system run on a network of relay stations, known as mutations for horse changes and mansuons for overnight stays. These were placed roughly every 8 to 12 Roman miles apart along the Via Publicae, the public roads. These roads weren't your average dirt paths. They were expertly engineered, often paved in stone, crowned in the middle for drainage, and straight enough to make a GPS weep with joy. Roman road building was serious business. All roads lead to Rome wasn't just a catchy saying, it was practically a corporate slogan. Couriers working for the Cursus Publicus were part endurance athlete, part soldier, and part living inbox. They travelled on horseback or in light wagons called Cisium, bouncing along Roman highways at speeds that made the average goat farmer's jaw drop. Official messages were written on wax tablets, which could be scratched out and reused, like a primitive but endlessly frustrating etch-a-sketch. And what kind of messages were they delivering? Military orders, census updates, governor's reports, news of rebellions, and those all-important birthday party invites from the emperor that were not optional. If a message bore the diploma, an official government travel warrant, it meant it was part of state business, and the courier had the power to requisition fresh horses, shelter, food, and the occasional side-eye from weary villagers. But let's be clear, this was not a public service. If you were a private citizen and wanted to send a letter to your long-lost cousin in Gaul, tough luck, unless you had a friend in high places or were prepared to grease the right palms. Your options were slim. Some wealthier Romans got around this by hiring their own messengers, often slaves or freedmen, to act as personal postmen. Others bribed Cursus Publicus personnel to sneak a scroll in with official mail, sort of like slipping your mixtape into the president's morning briefing. In fact, private mail became such an issue that emperors had to issue stern warnings about abusing the system. In one case, Emperor Hadrian, yes, the wall guy, had to remind people that the imperial post was not for personal business, greetings, or the delivery of chickens. Yes, someone actually tried to send poultry through government channels. Bureaucracy hasn't changed much. The system wasn't flawless. In times of civil war, roads became unsafe. Bandits were a recurring problem. Messages could be intercepted, misdelivered, or simply lost in the shuffle of someone's wax tablet collection. And if your courier didn't like you, well, let's just say your heartfelt scroll about olive prices might never make it past the next mutatio. Still, for its time, the Cursus Publicus was a logistical masterpiece. It made the Roman Empire feel smaller, more connected, and terrifyingly efficient at deploying legions when someone in the provinces started getting funny ideas about independence. And it wasn't just about speed, it was about reliability. A message could go from Rome to Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, in about a week, under ideal conditions. Not bad for a time when the fastest thing around had hooves and no understanding of international time zones. As the empire aged and eventually split into eastern and western halves, the Cursus Publicus slowly declined. Corruption crept in, the roads deteriorated, and by the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, the postal service had devolved into a shadow of its former self. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of trying to send a letter during a postal strike, except with more barbarian invasions. Still, the impact of the Roman postal system echoed through time. Later empires, from Byzantium to the Holy Roman Empire, tried to replicate it. Even modern postal mottos owe something to the Roman couriers who rode through blizzards, battles, and the occasional angry goat to deliver their precious scrolls. If you ever find yourself waking up in feudal Europe with an urgent message to send, Here's some advice: don't just give up. Or better yet, yell it at a bird and hope for divine intervention. Because medieval communication wasn't just slow, it was a high-stakes game of will this scroll survive the forest. The fall of the Roman Empire had left Europe with many things: broken roads, scattered kingdoms, and an impressive lack of shared calendars. While monks were busy preserving ancient texts, no one was preserving the idea of a reliable mail system. The early Middle Ages were like the post-apocalyptic era of communication. Everything was tribal, patchwork, and at the mercy of weather, wolves, and whatever political lunatic happened to be king that week. So, who did deliver messages during these chaotic centuries? Well, first up, monks. Yes, the men in robes who prayed, copied books, brewed beer, and accidentally preserved Western civilization also doubled as couriers. When not illuminating manuscripts or contemplating sin, monks were often dispatched by abbeys to deliver scrolls between religious houses. Think of it as faith-based logistics, powered by sandals, psalms, and a strong dislike of walking after sunset. But monk mail had limitations. It was local, slow, and highly dependent on spiritual motivation. Monks didn't travel at night. Evil spirits and potholes were both considered hazards, and they weren't exactly trained in self-defense. If a scroll didn't make it, it probably got rained on, lost in a bog, or traded for cheese at a village fair. For royal business, things were a little more theatrical. Enter the royal messengers, official riders who looked the part, dressed in elaborate livery, and carried messages sealed with wax, ribbons, or even bits of hair, because nothing says this is official like a follicle. These messengers travelled on horseback through rough terrain, muddy roads, and suspicious villages, flashing royal insignias to avoid tolls, or at least get fewer arrows shot at them. Of course, not every royal messenger could actually read the message he carried. Literacy wasn't exactly common among the lower nobility or upper chest muscles, but that didn't matter. Secrecy was maintained by ensuring the message stayed sealed until it reached someone important enough to decode it, often using ciphers, Latin, or just very fancy handwriting that no one could read anyway. Sometimes the sender would include oral instructions with the courier, basically telling him, "Give this scroll to Lord Bacon and tell him the part we didn't write down is burn the village and bring wine." And then, you just had to hope the messenger didn't forget it. Somewhere between the second muddy road and the third bandit ambush. Speaking of bandits, let's talk about the single greatest enemy of medieval correspondence. Every single road, Europe's road network had gone from Roman perfection to overgrown goat paths full of toll collectors, armed robbers, and angry cows. Travelling was not only slow but dangerous, which made sending a letter a true leap of faith. You weren't mailing a message, you were launching it into a world of risk, luck, and questionable hygiene. This is where merchant mail networks began to shine. By the late Middle Ages, especially around the 13th and 14th centuries, trade was booming. Merchants had cargo, contracts, and debts to send across Europe, and waiting for some sweaty noble on horseback wasn't going to cut it. So they built their own systems. In places like Venice, Florence, and the Hanseatic League cities, wealthy merchants employed private couriers to carry commercial letters. These weren't government services. They were business ventures, often using the same routes merchants travelled for trade. Some courier companies became remarkably efficient. Others were more like hope this scroll arrives eventually, or we're suing the donkey. A standout example was the Tasso family in northern Italy, who developed an early postal service for the Habsburgs and other elites. By the 1500s, technically bleeding into the Renaissance. But hey, late medieval habits die hard. They had relay stations, coded instructions, and uniformed messengers. They were basically the DHL of their day. If DHL delivered letters about grain prices while dodging plague carts. But even with improved merchant systems, your scroll was never safe. A courier might get robbed, a horse might bolt, or a local warlord might decide that anything sealed in wax was probably worth reading or eating. And the weather? Let's just say parchment does not do well in rain. Then there were the superstitions. Medieval people were, let's say, a little twitchy about magic. A scroll could be mistaken for a curse, especially if it was sealed with strange symbols or included drawings. Some unlucky couriers were attacked or arrested for delivering demonic letters, which often turned out to be legal documents. Honestly fair. And sealing a letter wasn't just practical. It was ritual. Wax seals bore personal insignias and were pressed with signet rings, creating a unique imprint that proved the letter was authentic, or at least forged by someone who owned the same ring. Tampering with someone's seal was considered a serious crime, often punishable by fine, imprisonment, or a stern lecture by someone with a large sword. So sending a message in medieval Europe wasn't just communication, it was an event. It required planning, money, a trusted courier, and a healthy appetite for chaos. In other words, it was the medieval version of hitting send, and then watching your email vanish into the void without knowing if it bounced, got filtered as spam, or arrived upside down. There was a time when angry people had to yell in the town square to get their point across, but thanks to the invention of the printing press, they could now yell in mass production. Welcome to the Reformation, when religious reform met cutting-edge technology and decided to start one of the loudest, most opinionated postal explosions in European history. The printing press, introduced by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, was a game-changer. Before this, copying a book meant hiring a monk with good penmanship and a lot of free time. But with movable type, you could print page after page of whatever you wanted. Books, pamphlets, letters, conspiracy theories. Suddenly, anyone with a printing press and a strong opinion could flood Europe with hot takes faster than the Pope could say, heresy. Enter Martin Luther, monk, theologian, and part-time printing industry mascot. In 1517, he nailed, or possibly mailed, his 95 theses to the church door. In Wittenberg, a move that was basically the theological equivalent of hitting reply all with a strongly worded email. And thanks to the printing press, those theses spread like medieval wildfire. No horses required. In just weeks, thousands of copies had been printed and distributed across Germany. Within months, they had reached France, England, and parts of Italy. Luther had essentially gone viral in a time when most people still thought bathing once a month was a flex, and this sudden explosion of written content caused something else to explode: the need for better postal networks. Prior to this, most people didn't need to send messages beyond their own village, unless they were royalty, merchants, or very ambitious gossips. But now, everyone wanted to circulate letters, pamphlets, counter-pamphlets, counter-counter-pamphlets, and the occasional death threat, all via the mail. The Reformation didn't just spark theological debates, it created an information arms race, and the post office was caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, couriers weren't just carrying tax notices or royal decrees, they were schlepping sacks of furious pamphlets, fiery sermons, and occasionally bizarre woodcut drawings of the Pope riding a seven-headed donkey. This wasn't just about Protestants. The Catholic Church quickly realized that if they wanted to keep up, they'd have to fight back on the same battlefield, the printed page. So began an all-out print war, with each side publishing documents faster than they could be debunked, and flooding the postal system with religious content, ideological smackdowns. Postmasters, those brave, paper-cut riddled souls, were now caught between the quill and the pitchfork. In towns across Europe, they were tasked with distributing huge volumes of printed material, while trying to avoid accusations of bias. Deliver a Protestant tract in a Catholic stronghold, that could earn you a fine or a visit from the local Inquisition. Deliver the wrong message to the wrong bishop, suddenly you're explaining yourself while tied to a stake, and things got worse. Governments realized that controlling the mail meant controlling the message. They started appointing official censors, intercepting unapproved materials, and punishing those who dared send or receive content critical of the crown, the church, or whoever was in power that week. The mail wasn't just transportation, it was surveillance. So now the postmaster wasn't just someone who handed off letters, he was part government agent, part diplomat, part librarian, and part professional nose-breather, trying not to panic as he sorted through 16 pamphlets, arguing about the soul's proximity to heaven. Meanwhile, printers were working overtime, often under dangerous conditions. Print shops became hives of dissent, collaboration, and ink stains that never quite came off. Some printers had to flee cities at night when their content turned out to be a little too spicy. Others were paid handsomely to crank out propaganda, like the 16th century version of going viral with a branded tweet. But it wasn't all fire and brimstone. For the first time, ordinary people, merchants, teachers, farmers, who could read or had friends who could, had access to ideas from far beyond their own towns. Letters became more frequent, and people began exchanging news, religious views, and extremely outdated memes, usually involving pigs and devils. The printing press didn't just create religious revolution, it democratized information, and the mail system had to catch up. Slowly across various kingdoms, new postal routes were mapped, new regulations introduced, and state-run mail services expanded to include the transport of printed matter. In some places, printers even had direct contracts with postal authorities to guarantee their material would reach specific cities, provided, of course, it didn't insult the king, or mention that one time he accidentally declared war on his cousin's cat. The result? A communications revolution that shaped Europe forever. Ideas now had legs, literal legs, attached to exhausted couriers, who probably just wanted to go back to delivering recipes and love letters. Welcome to the early days of the Royal Mail, when post wasn't just slow, it was expensive, exclusive, and occasionally featured in palace drama. Our story kicks off in 16th this century England, when a certain monarch with too many wives and a strong distaste for papal authority, Henry VIII, decided he needed a better way to send messages. Not love letters, he had messengers for that, but official government correspondence. Spies, orders, declarations, and strongly worded notes to Rome all needed safe, reliable transport. So in 1516, Henry created the Royal Mail, appointing Sir Brian Tuke, who sounds like someone who might also own a sword and a vineyard, as the master of the posts. The name alone suggests the job was 70% paperwork, 30% explaining to angry barons why their scrolls hadn't arrived. Now, let's be clear, the Royal Mail was not for peasants, or merchants, or even nobles, unless you were extremely in the king's favour, or paid dearly. This was a state communication system, designed to shuffle important information between royal courts, military leaders, and administrative agents. If you weren't on crown business, you'd better have a really convincing bribe, or a cousin who owned a lot of horses. Still, the system grew. Under Elizabeth I and James VI, postal routes expanded, and regular stages between London and key cities like Edinburgh and Dover were established. These were relays staffed by innkeepers, horse swappers, and men with very questionable maps. A letter could now make it across the kingdom in days instead of weeks, as long as no one got drunk, robbed, or distracted by a jousting tournament. But here's the kicker. If you sent a letter during this era, the recipient paid for it. That's right. No prepaid stamps, no clicking send. You wrote the letter, handed it off to the courier, and the person at the other end got a knock on the door, followed by, "Hello, you owe the crown 3 shillings for a note from your aunt," and if they refused to pay, the letter didn't get delivered, or it was opened and read aloud by a curious tavern keeper, or it was sold as scrap paper. This was basically Victorian ghosting with a financial twist. Someone could write a breakup letter, send it, and the recipient would not only be dumped but charged for the privilege. This pay-on-delivery system wasn't just annoying, it was inefficient. People would game it by writing short messages on the outside of the letter, so the recipient could read it without accepting the delivery. One-liner hacks, like "I've arrived safely," or "Don't trust Cousin Harold," were scrawled right on the folded paper, like medieval post-it notes. Things began to shift in the 17th and 18th centuries, especially in France, where Louis XIV, probably while lounging under a chandelier, realized that mail could be a lucrative business. The French established a more centralized, state-run postal system, with appointed postmasters, fixed rates, and official uniforms. And in true French fashion, the mail carriers were expected to walk with a sense of dignity, even if they were delivering bad poetry and worse perfume ads. But the real postal revolution, that came with the penny post. Fast forward to 1840s Britain, and things were getting steamy, not just in factories, but in the post office. A man named Rowland Hill, probably tired of watching everyone avoid letters like they were tax collectors, proposed something radical: prepaid postage. One price, no surprises, accessible to all. Thus, the penny post was born. For a single penny, anyone could send a letter anywhere in the country. It was democratizing, efficient, and best of all, came with a sticker. Enter the penny black, the world's first adhesive postage stamp, featuring a rather stern portrait of Queen Victoria, who looked like she hadn't gotten mail from Albert in weeks. This little square of black paper changed everything. It showed that you'd paid up front, which meant the mail carrier couldn't hold your letter hostage, like a 17th century ransom note. The stamp was simple but revolutionary. Suddenly, regular people could afford to communicate. Love letters, business deals, family updates, all became faster and more reliable. And while the Queen's profile didn't exactly scream fun correspondence, it did guarantee royal approval and a lot of envelopes with her resting monarch face on them. Other countries quickly followed. France issued its own stamps. Germany and the United States joined the sticky party. The post office, once an elite service for kings and merchants, was now a global network for everyone, including poets, pranksters, and that one uncle who sends you cryptic postcards about weather and regrets. Of course, not everything was smooth. People licked way too many stamps. Some tried to reuse them illegal, but impressively frugal, and occasionally, mail was still lost, trampled, or delivered to the wrong Mr. Smith, in a town full of Smiths. But overall, the system worked, and worked well enough that we still use it, despite the invention of email, texting, and shouting at people on the internet. Long before the US Postal Service had trucks, zip codes, and commemorative Elvis stamps, mail delivery in the American colonies was a wild, clunky, horse-powered affair, full of detours, sabotage, and men carrying ink-stained letters while dodging musket balls. In early colonial America, mail wasn't a right. It was a luxury, like owning a second pair of boots, or knowing someone who didn't churn their own butter. The first settlers brought with them a very British concept of postal service, namely, that it was for the upper crust, and absolutely no one else. If you wanted to send a letter, you either handed it to someone travelling in that general direction, gave it to a sea captain with a good memory, or tied it to a dog and crossed your fingers. Then came Benjamin Franklin, inventor of bifocals, kite flyer extraordinaire, world-class flirt, and crucially, Postmaster General. In 1737, Franklin was appointed Postmaster of Philadelphia, and by 1753, he became Joint Postmaster General for the American colonies. This was a man who took mail seriously. He saw communication as the glue that could hold a country, or at least a very argumentative collection of colonies together. Franklin did not waste time. He mapped better delivery routes, introduced mile markers, hired competent riders, a rarity, and even timed postal trips to figure out where the delays were. This wasn't just efficiency, it was revolution with a saddlebag. And speaking of revolutions, as tensions grew between the colonies and the British Crown, mail became more than a delivery system. It became a weapon. You can't organize a rebellion with smoke signals and gossip. Revolutionaries needed a way to move news, warnings, and propaganda faster than the redcoats could say, "You owe us tea money," so they built a shadow system. In 1774, after Benjamin Franklin was fired by the British for the crime of being too awesome and too rebellious, the Continental Congress created the Constitutional Post. It was America's first independent postal system, and Ben, naturally, was their first Postmaster General. He accepted the position with a smirk, and probably a few jokes at King George's expense. The mail became a revolutionary lifeline. Letters between colonies warned of British troop movements. Committees of correspondence circulated fiery pamphlets and rallying cries for independence. Even General Washington relied heavily on mail to organize troops, request supplies, and complain about how cold it was in Valley Forge. But it wasn't easy. Mail delivery during the American Revolution was essentially a full-contact sport. Couriers rode on horseback through forests, across rivers, and over rough terrain, hoping not to run into British patrols or trigger-happy militiamen who weren't great at asking questions first. Some messages had to be smuggled inside boots, stitched into coats, or hidden in hollowed-out walking sticks. Secrecy was essential, and mail theft was rampant. Both sides engaged in postal sabotage, intercepting enemy correspondence, forging letters, or spreading disinformation. It was espionage meets calligraphy. And then there were the roads, or more accurately, the hope of roads. In rural colonies, a road might be a glorified deer trail, a muddy wagon rut, or a stretch of land shared by livestock and people with bad directions. Riders frequently got lost, attacked, or simply gave up. There was no GPS. There was barely a map. You had your horse, a name, and the vague hope that someone in town had heard of the person you were looking for. Mail carriers weren't military, but they weren't civilians either. They operated in a grey area, neither uniformed nor armed, yet incredibly important. If they were captured by the British, they could be treated as spies. If they were caught by loyalists, they might be roughed up, or worse. Delivering mail was 50% logistics, 50% dodgeball, and 100% not covered by dental insurance. Still, against all odds, the system grew. Post offices were established in key towns, riders became more experienced, routes became more reliable. By the time the war ended, and the US became an independent nation, the mail system was already functioning as a backbone of communication. It had proven its worth, not just as a delivery tool, but as a force for unity and nation building. In fact, the post office was so important that it was written directly into the Constitution. Article S, Section 8, gives Congress the power to establish post offices and post roads. That's right. America guaranteed itself mail before it guaranteed things like, say, clean drinking water or universal suffrage. Priorities. After the war, the newly formed United States Post Office Department continued expanding under Franklin's successors. They established rates, routes, and a growing number of postmasters, many of whom were local bigwigs or war veterans trying to figure out what to do now that fighting the British wasn't a full-time job anymore. But even as things formalized, the legacy of Revolutionary-era mail endured, scrappy, determined, and just organized enough to function. The American post was never glamorous. It was gritty, heroic, and built by people who understood that carrying a message wasn't just a job, it was a contribution to something bigger than themselves, like freedom, or at least, less expensive tea. In the grand saga of American mail history, few chapters are as short, dramatic, and utterly bonkers as the Pony Express. It was the startup that burned bright, ran fast, and died young. If mail delivery systems were rock bands, the Pony Express would be the one that released one killer album, destroyed a hotel room, and vanished into legend by morning. It all started in 1860, when the US had a very large problem, the West. California had joined the Union a decade earlier, but it might as well have been a separate planet. The telegraph hadn't yet reached the Pacific coast, and steamships had to take the scenic route around South America, a voyage so long you could write your will and still have time for a nap. The mail took weeks, even months, to cross the continent, and with the threat of civil war looming, the government and businesses alike were desperate for faster communication. Enter Russell, Majors, and Waddell, three businessmen with a dream, a budget made of string and hope, and a willingness to risk bankruptcy for the sake of a faster letter. Their solution? Horses, lots of them, and teenage boys with questionable decision-making skills. The Pony Express was born as a relay mail service that spanned roughly 1,900 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. The idea was simple. Build a chain of relay stations, place fresh horses every 10-15 miles, and have a rider switch mounts and keep going, day or night, rain or snow, bandits, bears, blizzards. Nothing stops the mail. Each rider was chosen for three key qualities: lightweight, preferably under 125 pounds, so the horse wouldn't file a complaint; fearless, as in fully comfortable galloping at full speed across hostile territory with only a revolver and sheer bravado; expendable, which is why so many were under 20, some were as young as 11. The official job description might as well have read, must be light, fast, and totally okay with dying in Nevada. Mail was packed into a special saddlebag called a mochila, which could be quickly slung over the next horse at a station. This minimized stop times. Riders didn't rest. They didn't chat. They barely ate. They rode up to 100 miles per shift, switching horses 8 to 10 times along the way, and then collapsed in the dirt until their next shift. A letter carried by the Pony Express could reach California in 10 days, a record at the time, and the cost. Initially, $5 per half ounce, or roughly $180 in today's money. In other words, this was premium shipping, designed for governments, newspapers, and that one rich guy who really needed to tell his cousin he lost a poker bet. The route was brutal. Riders crossed the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Great Plains, passing through what is now Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. Every part of it screamed danger. There were Native American tribes, some of whom were understandably annoyed at the sudden flood of riders galloping through their lands. There were outlaws, bandits, and weather patterns, that didn't care about your urgent letter to San Francisco. In winter, riders faced snowstorms. In summer, blistering heat and dehydration. Some carried water, others relied on luck and whatever ponds hadn't been claimed by rattlesnakes. The Pony Express didn't promise comfort, it promised speed. Everything else was optional, including survival. And yet, in its short life, it captured the imagination of a nation. Newspapers followed the Pony Express like it was the Super Bowl of logistics. People cheered at stations when riders galloped through. It was the symbol of frontier determination. Young men on fast horses, delivering hope across a vast untamed continent. But there was one problem. Money. The Pony Express was bleeding it. The cost of building and maintaining hundreds of relay stations, hiring riders, buying thousands of horses, and defending the route from hostile forces far exceeded any revenue. It was a financial disaster disguised as a bold experiment. And then came the telegraph. In October 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. A message that once took 10 days could now be sent in seconds. Morse code didn't need horses, saddles, or kids named Buck with a Colt .45 and a death wish. It was faster, cheaper, and didn't poop. On October 26, 1861, just 18 months after it began, the Pony Express officially shut down. No parade, no farewell party, just a final ride into history. Yet, despite its failure as a business, the Pony Express became a legend. It embodied the grit of the frontier, the wild energy of westward expansion, and America's never-ending quest to do something wildly inefficient, just to prove it could be done. Today, it's romanticized in books, movies, and postage stamps. The original route is a historic trail. You can even see mochilas, station ruins, and monuments to the brave and slightly unhinged men who risked everything for the sake of a letter. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was no longer just a collection of East Coast cities and dusty Western hopes. It had become a full-blown coast-to-coast quilt of towns, farms, boomtowns, and places with names like Possum Neck and Upper Squabble, which meant one thing: the mail system needed a serious upgrade, or risk being outpaced by goats and gossip. Enter the newly organized United States Postal Service, which was determined to modernize the entire operation without letting it descend into a nationwide scavenger hunt. This was the age of institutionalization, when throwing it on a horse and hoping for the best was replaced with timetables, uniforms, postmarks, and a whole lot of very stressed clerks. Let's start with the Civil War. You might think a national conflict, where half the country seceded, would disrupt the mail. And you'd be right. The North and South quickly established separate postal services, because what's a war without competing envelopes? The Union Post Office ran a tight ship, even during wartime. Meanwhile, the Confederate Post Office scrambled to print stamps, deliver letters, and not lose all their ink to blockades. Spoiler, they lost a lot of ink. But once the war ended, and the country awkwardly stitched itself back together, the post office faced a new challenge: America's rural population. Most people didn't live in cities. They lived in farms, cabins, and settlements, located approximately 3 goats past the last dirt road. Previously, if you lived out in the sticks, you had to ride into town and pick up your mail yourself, assuming it hadn't already been claimed by someone else named Jeb. The solution came in the form of Rural Free Delivery, RFD, introduced in 1896. This was revolutionary. For the first time, postal carriers would bring the mail directly to rural homes, no extra charge. Farmers could now get their letters, newspapers, and tractor catalogues without taking a half-day journey in a cart with a squeaky axle and a mule named Disappointment. The government wasn't sure people wanted it, but once farmers realized they didn't have to ride 10 miles to find out their cousin Elmer had dysentery, they became very enthusiastic about RFD. The program spread like butter on cornbread, and by the early 20th century, rural mail was a standard part of life. Finally, federal bureaucracy had fans, as long as it showed up with coupons. But it wasn't just delivery that changed, it was what you could send. In 1913, the US launched parcel post, allowing people to mail packages as well as letters, and Americans wasted no time testing the system's limits. They mailed furniture, eggs, farm equipment. At one point, a family even mailed a baby. Yes, a real human baby. by strapping stamps to his jacket and shipping him to Grandma. Don't worry, he arrived safely. And yes, postal regulations changed shortly after. Meanwhile, postal workers became national icons. Clad in blue uniforms with satchels of destiny, they trudged through rain, snow, sleet, and the occasional hostile chicken to deliver the goods. Their unofficial motto, neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night, became a badge of honor, even though it was technically borrowed from ancient Persian couriers. But hey, if it sounds noble and involves mail, America's claiming it. And just when you thought the mail couldn't go any faster, it took to the skies. The first official airmail flight in the US took place in 1918, when brave and perhaps slightly unhinged pilots began flying between Washington, D.C. and New York. These weren't sleek commercial jets. These were open cockpit biplanes, built out of canvas, wood, and audacity. Pilots flew in goggles, scarves, and the blind trust that someone somewhere had mapped this route better than with a crayon. Navigation, primitive at best. Many early pilots relied on barn roofs, painted with city names, railroads, and pure vibes. Radio? Nope. GPS? Ha. It was just wind luck and a deep personal relationship with the concept of, oops, planes got lost, planes crashed. At one point a pilot landed in the wrong state entirely. Another ran out of fuel and had to borrow gas from a confused farmer. But despite the hiccups, airmail revolutionized long-distance communication. What once took days by train now arrived in hours, assuming the pilot didn't detour for pie or get blown off course by a stiff breeze. By the 1920s and 30s, air routes became more established. Night flying became possible, thanks to a system of lighted beacons, which sounds great until you realize it meant flying over mountains by moonlight, hoping not to meet a cliff at 90 miles per hour. But the speed and spectacle of airmail helped modernize the postal system, pushing the government to invest more in infrastructure, airports, and faster processing. Postal service had officially gone from hoofbeats to propellers, and while the journey was bumpy both figuratively and literally, the mail was moving faster, farther, and more reliably than ever before. For centuries, humanity built elaborate systems of riders, pigeons, boats, horses, and airplanes just to deliver a small folded piece of paper. And then, almost overnight, someone said, hey, what if we skip all that and just annoy people instantly? Thus began the reign of email, and with it, the tragic demotion of the mailbox from honored portal of communication to spider-infested relic. Let's rewind to the 1970s, a time of flared pants, questionable haircuts, and one of the most quietly revolutionary inventions of all, electronic mail. In 1971, a man named Ray Tomlinson, working on ARPANET, the prehistoric internet's awkward uncle, sent the very first email. What mattered was this: the age of instant digital communication had begun. Unlike traditional mail, which involved envelopes, stamps, and occasionally bribing the postmaster with pie, email was free, fast, and completely dependent on whether your modem didn't scream like a banshee when connecting to the internet. The idea that you could type a message and have it arrive in seconds without leaving your chair was nothing short of wizardry. People were ecstatic. Businesses embraced it. Universities swapped notes without licking a single envelope. It was the dawn of a glorious future. And then came the spam. The first recognized spam email hit in 1978. It was a message promoting a computer system, sent to hundreds of people who immediately went, wait, what is this garbage? Thus began a long and storied tradition, unsolicited digital nonsense that clogs your inbox like a paper jam in a laser printer made of lies. Spam evolved quickly. It started with bad promotions and quickly escalated to miracle pills, sketchy princes in need of wire transfers, and desperate pleas from long-lost business partners who just needed your social security number. Email was no longer a miracle. It was a minefield of digital desperation. And yet, we couldn't stop. As email became ubiquitous in the 90s and 2000s, the inbox replaced the mailbox. Letters became text on screens. Birthday cards turned into JPEGs. Love notes became awkwardly formatted Arial font. And junk mail, oh, it upgraded too, migrating from paper flyers to endless digital newsletters you swear you never subscribed to. Meanwhile, as email took over the office, another beast briefly roared to life: the fax machine. The fax was the halfway house between snail mail and email, a mutant hybrid that required you to print a page, feed it into a noisy device, and then hope it didn't jam halfway through a contract. It worked by scanning documents, converting them into sound, yes, really, and transmitting them through telephone lines, like a robot whispering sweet nothings into the void. For a brief period in the 1980s and 90s, the fax machine was the office MVP. You could send documents across the country in minutes, as long as nobody picked up the phone line to call grandma halfway through. Businesses faxed invoices, letters, resumes, and legal threats at such high volumes that paper sales soared and entire forests considered filing harassment lawsuits. But it was short-lived. The rise of PDFs and email attachments turned fax machines into glorified paperweights, occasionally dusted off to send a blurry prescription to a confused pharmacy. Still, for a glorious window of time, the fax machine gave mail a mechanical makeover and made everything sound just a little bit haunted. As the 2000s marched on, email became our new mailbox, and much like physical mail, it became a battlefield of organization versus entropy. People declared inbox bankruptcy, filters were invented, spam folders became bloated wastelands of suspicious links and messages from Nigerian royalty. Email etiquette guides were published and ignored. Suddenly, we had more ways to not respond than ever before. Where once you had to wait a week for a reply and assume someone had died if they didn't write back, now you could see that they'd opened your email, ignored it, and then posted a beach photo on Instagram. Even work culture wasn't safe. The corporate world dove headfirst into email obsession. Office workers now received hundreds of emails a day, many of them saying absolutely nothing but circling back or per my last email. Phrases designed to sound polite while fueling quiet rage. The once efficient medium became a vortex of confusion, delays, and passive-aggressive punctuation. And let's not forget chain emails, which were the spiritual successors to medieval curses and 1990s playground rumors. If you didn't forward 1 to 10 friends, you'd have bad luck. If you did, you'd have no friends left. Some offered blessings, others threats, and most were written in Comic Sans with clip art that screamed, "My aunt made this." But despite the chaos, email revolutionized communication. It bridged continents in seconds. It enabled entire industries. It allowed distant families to stay in touch, office workers to passive-aggressively nudge each other, and spammers to practice creative fiction. Today, the battle continues. We now manage mail across platforms. And yet, for all our advancements, we still feel the same sense of existential dread when we see 47 unread messages blinking at us from a tiny screen. Welcome to the present day, a time when your mailbox still exists, but mostly holds pizza coupons, mysterious envelopes, and the occasional spider condo. And yet, despite the digital takeover, physical mail isn't dead. It's just having a bit of an identity crisis. Somewhere between nostalgic tradition and robotic efficiency, the modern postal service is clinging to relevance with a barcode scanner in one hand and a budget deficit in the other. Let's talk about robots. Because yes, they're here, and they're sorting your packages faster than any sleep-deprived human ever could. Postal facilities around the world now use automated sorting machines, which can process thousands of parcels per hour with all the mechanical grace of a caffeinated octopus. These machines zip letters and boxes along conveyor belts, scan them with lasers, rid handwriting that looks like hieroglyphics, and fling them into destination bins at speeds that would terrify a 19th century mail coach driver. But while the machines are thriving, the humans are, well, not. Your average postal worker today is juggling a workload that includes sorting, driving, delivering, smiling politely at barking dogs, navigating GPS errors, and explaining to customers why their Amazon package says delivered, even though it's currently vacationing in a different zip code. Then there's the United States Postal Service, USPS, a 240-year-old institution that has survived wars, weather, and whatever weird energy Ben Franklin was putting out. But in the modern era, it's become something of a bureaucratic gymnast, constantly twisting itself into impossible shapes to deliver billions of items each year, while facing budget cuts, and memes about mailmen hiding packages under doormats made of glass. USPS is expected to act like a business, turn a profit, be efficient, compete with private companies, while also being a public service, deliver to every home in America, no matter how remote, no matter how many porcupines live on the porch. It's like being told to run a 5-star restaurant and a soup kitchen at the same time, with one spatula and no funding. And speaking of competition, the modern post has been side-eyed by the big players. Hello, Amazon, UPS and FedEx, who now promise same-day delivery, live package tracking, and the ability to watch your driver's existential crisis in real time via app. Amazon, especially, has become a delivery behemoth, building its own logistics empire that includes planes, vans, locker hubs, and an army of people who run across lawns like action heroes to get you your toothpaste by 8 p.m. Yet, ironically, Amazon still relies heavily on USPS, especially for last-mile delivery in rural areas. Why? Because no one else wants to drive 37 miles into the forest to deliver a phone case to a guy named Dale, who lives next to an elk sanctuary. And let's not forget the mail itself. These days, it's mostly bills, so many bills. Catalogs you never asked for. Credit card offers addressed to the former raccoon that used to live at your address. But despite this flood of junk, people still love mail. There's something undeniably human about it. A letter you can touch, a package you unwrap, a postcard with "wish you were here," that wasn't written by a bot trying to sell you crypto. That said, the future is coming faster than you can say informed delivery notification. We now have drones being tested for deliveries, because nothing says the future like your burrito arriving from the sky. AI-powered mail sorting, which may soon understand even the wildest cursive scrawl your grandma can produce. Smart mailboxes with tracking sensors, delivery robots that roll down sidewalks, beep politely, and terrify dogs. And then there's the real wild card, psychic delivery. Just kidding. But give it a decade. You might soon receive mail via ThoughtBeam, or at least a hologram of your aunt, reminding you that you never replied to her Christmas card. Still, even with robots and AI, postal workers remain the heart of the system. They brave icy driveways, dog ambushes, weird smells from basement apartments, and the crushing weight of 47 Amazon packages stacked like Tetris blocks in the back of a van. They deliver to islands, mountaintops, and middle-of-nowhere cabins where Wi-Fi fears to tread. And despite everything, budget crises, mail delays, inbox saturation, the wrath of Mercury in retrograde, the mail still gets through. Well, unless it's a holiday. The weather is bad. Someone left the gate open, and now there's a loose goose. The package is in transit for the 6th consecutive day, or Mercury is in retrograde, and the postal truck broke down next to a haunted Radio Shack. Nikola Tesla didn't enter the world quietly. He arrived in the middle of a lightning storm on July 10th, 1856, in the small village of Smiljan, nestled in what is now Croatia. His midwife, understandably shaken by the storm, allegedly said, "This child will be a child of darkness," to which his mother replied, "No, of light." Cue the dramatic music and the opening credits of a superhero movie. Except this wasn't fiction. This was Nikola freaking Tesla, and his life would read like something Marvel rejected for being too far-fetched. Tesla's family was of Serbian descent, and his father, Milutin Tesla, was a Serbian Orthodox priest and a writer. Not your average bring your kid to work situation, unless your workplace involves cassocks, sermons, and arguing about theology by candlelight. His mother, Uka Mandic, was the real deal when it came to early influence. She was an inventor herself, creating mechanical tools, household gadgets, and get this, memorizing epic poems while churning butter. Multitasking was genetic in this family. From a young age, Tesla showed signs of a mind that ran on something other than human software. He reportedly had a photographic memory, which sounds cool until you realize it came with a side of involuntary hallucinations. He would often see flashes of light, visualize entire machines in his head, and suffer from an overwhelming sensitivity to sound, light, and even physical touch. Imagine trying to grow up while being a cross between a baby genius and a faulty antenna. As a child, he could memorize books, word for word, like entire books, for fun. You know, just in case you were feeling good about yourself today. He once recited entire volumes of Goethe and Byron to pass the time, because nothing says playtime like 19th century romantic poetry. While other kids were chasing frogs, Tesla was mentally inventing devices, and trying to figure out how to harness the power of the local river to generate mechanical energy. You know, standard, third-grade stuff. But it wasn't all light bulbs and genius visions. Tesla's childhood was also marked by tragedy. He had an older brother, Dane, who was the golden boy of the family, smarter, more talented, according to his parents, and possibly psychic. When Dane died tragically in a horse-riding accident, when Tesla was just 5, young Nikola was devastated. Some biographers believe that this trauma, combined with a desperate need to prove himself in Dane's shadow, helped fuel his lifelong obsession with greatness. Others think he was just wired differently from birth. Either way, the grief shaped him, possibly giving his already unstable mind an extra jolt of ambition. Tesla's early interest in electricity wasn't purely academic. It bordered on spiritual obsession. As a boy, he became fascinated with the idea that energy was all around us, waiting to be tapped, controlled, and distributed. He'd watch lightning storms for hours, mesmerized by the chaos of it all. It wasn't just weather, it was a language, and he was determined to translate it. By the time he was a teenager, Tesla had already decided he wanted to be an engineer, a choice that clashed violently with his father's plan for him to become a priest. There were arguments, there were tears, there were probably a lot of stern Serbian dad lectures, but when Nikola contracted cholera and nearly died, he pulled what can only be described as a dramatic power play. From his feverish bed, he said he'd recover. If his father agreed to let him study engineering, Milutin, realizing that the priesthood was less appealing to someone dying of diarrhea and existential dread, agreed. Tesla recovered. The world shivered slightly. It's important to understand that Tesla didn't just dream about machines. He saw them in his head, fully formed. He once wrote, "Before I put a sketch on paper, the whole idea is worked out mentally." He would visualize gears turning, electric currents flowing, and devices operating in his mind with such clarity that by the time he built them, they almost always worked. Basically, he had a built-in CAD program, centuries before computers existed. But even as a boy, he wasn't exactly normal. He avoided touching hair, jewelry, or round objects. Buttons, especially, freaked him out. He counted steps obsessively and hated pearls to the point of nausea. Most kids collect rocks or action figures. Tesla collected neuroses. What truly sets his childhood apart, though, is the foreshadowing. Nearly everything about Tesla's early years reads like the setup for a mythic tale. A boy born in a storm, gifted with second sight, or at least second guesses, grieving a dead brother and battling illness. Torn between religious tradition and scientific revolution. The kind of person who doesn't just wonder how the world works, he wants to rewire it. And so, armed with a brain full of thunder and a mother who encouraged invention over confession, Tesla set out to become the most electrifying man of the 19th century. Literally, by the time Nikola Tesla reached university age, he was the human equivalent of a brain with legs that barely slept. His mind buzzed with equations, inventions, and wild theories, and the only thing moving faster than his neurons was his mounting anxiety. He began his higher education at the Austrian Polytechnic in Craze in 1875, on a military scholarship that required him to keep his grades sparkling, and sparkle they did. During his first year, Tesla pulled off an academic hat-trick straight as, perfect attendance and professors questioning whether he was immortal or just a math-producing ghost. He studied like sleep was a conspiracy, and regularly put in up to 20 hours a day reading, calculating, and presumably forgetting what daylight looked like. One of his professors, realizing Tesla might not have an off switch, reportedly wrote to his father warning that Nikola was working himself to death. His response was, essentially, tell him to keep it up. Tesla developed a fierce obsession with mathematics and electrical engineering, fueled by a burning desire to understand the forces of nature, not just how they worked, but how to tame them. He devoured textbooks the way normal students devoured beer and stress. He could visualize engines turning in his head, adjust them mentally, and calculate efficiency without touching a pencil. One classmate said Tesla would take complex problems the rest of the class spent hours on and solve them in seconds without writing a single number down. And then, it all fell apart. By his second year, Tesla's mind began to buckle under the strain. He had burned too hot for too long. He began to skip classes, argue with professors, and develop odd behavior that teetered between eccentric and deeply concerning. He'd swing from hyper-focus to paranoid dread, obsessing over minutiae, His roommates reportedly caught him talking to imaginary people, and he'd wander around campus making abstract hand gestures, like he was rearranging invisible wires in the air. Tesla didn't just push himself. He chased his own sanity around a mental racetrack, and at some point, he lost the lead. He became addicted to gambling, believing he could calculate outcomes with mathematical precision. Unfortunately, roulette wheels don't care about genius. He lost his tuition money, begged his family for more, and then lost that too. For someone who would later envision a future powered by limitless energy, he had a tragic talent for running out of cash. Eventually, in 1878, Tesla dropped out of the Polytechnic, not with a bang, but with a blur. He vanished. No formal withdrawal, no goodbye, just disappeared. Went full AWOL. Friends and professors were baffled. His family assumed the worst. Rumors spread that he'd drowned in the Mur River. The university, having no body and no forwarding address, shrugged and moved on. But Tesla hadn't died. He had simply gone rogue. Over the next year or so, he bounced around like a wandering intellect, eventually resurfacing in Maribor. Working as a draftsman and assistant engineer, he taught himself new languages, because why not? And spent his free time walking miles alone, gesturing at the sky, sketching devices in the dirt, and continuing the ongoing battle between brilliance and burnout. At one point, his father found him, half-starved and mentally fraying. The man who once demanded Tesla become a priest was now begging him to return to school, to find some stability, or at least remember to eat occasionally. Tesla agreed, and attempted to enroll at Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, but he arrived too late in the term and didn't meet the language requirements for philosophy classes. So instead of a degree, Tesla graduated from the University of Hard Knocks, with majors in having genius meltdowns in public and trying to invent yourself out of poverty. Despite his lack of formal credentials, he continued to invent constantly, building mental blueprints for machines no one had imagined yet. Induction motors, generators, oscillators. It didn't matter that he was sleeping on couches or arguing with lampposts. His brain was still open for business, and business was booming. Tesla's early 20s were a crucible. He learned that brilliance doesn't insulate you from collapse, and being the smartest guy in the room means very little when your nerves are fraying, and your diet consists of guilt and questionable stew. But it was also a time when his obsessions crystallized. He became convinced that the world could be powered wirelessly, that energy flowed invisibly through the air, and that he could build a system to tap into that current. Clean, efficient, and practically magical. He just needed someone to believe in him. Spoiler, they wouldn't. Not right away. But his storm was building. By 1884, Nikola Tesla had finally decided to jump continents and try his luck in the ultimate land of opportunity. America, where dreams were big, expectations were bigger, and the electrical grid was still in its chaotic toddler phase. He arrived in New York City with little more than a suitcase full of calculations, 4 cents in his pocket, and the kind of untamed ambition that makes customs agents nervous. Fortunately, Tesla also had a letter of introduction addressed to none other than Thomas Edison, the reigning king of electricity. The note allegedly described Tesla as someone who had more raw talent in his little finger than most inventors had in their entire lifetime, which, to be fair, was not the most tactful way to introduce a guy to the man he was about to threaten professionally and existentially. Still, Edison offered Tesla a job. At first, Tesla began working for Edison Machine Works, where he was tasked with improving Edison's direct current DC electrical systems. Edison's DC setup was already powering parts of New York, and he was deeply invested, emotionally and financially, in keeping it that way. Unfortunately, DC had some limitations, like how it couldn't travel very far without losing juice, which meant cities would need power stations every other block, like Starbucks franchises, but with more soot. Tesla, always the walking think tank, quickly realized that alternating current AC would be a much better solution. AC could travel long distances, it was more efficient, and it didn't require a power plant every time someone wanted to light a lamp 3 blocks away. But when he proposed this to Edison, the response was basically, "No thanks, I'm busy inventing the future my way. Go tighten some bolts." Still, Edison gave Tesla a challenge: redesign the DC generators and improve them for efficiency. If Tesla succeeded, Edison promised a tidy sum of $50,000, which in 1880s money was enough to buy a mansion, a lab, and possibly a small army of trained squirrels. Tesla took the bait. He dove into the project with characteristic fury, working late hours, redesigning machines, solving issues Edison's other engineers hadn't even dared to diagram. After weeks of work, Tesla presented his improvements. They were brilliant, revolutionary, exactly what Edison needed. And Edison's response? A shrug and a smirk. "You don't understand our American humor," he reportedly told Tesla. "No payment, no bonus, just a broken promise," and the vague feeling that Tesla had just been emotionally pickpocketed. Tesla, ever the idealist, had just been given his first taste of American business etiquette, which in this case came with a side of betrayal and a heaping serving of start-your-own-company nerd. So he quit, with flair. He walked out of Edison's lab, and for a while was forced to dig ditches for telegraph lines to make ends meet. Imagine a man who had dreams of wireless global energy, shoveling mud to afford lunch. Welcome to capitalism, Tesla. But if Edison thought the story ended there, he severely underestimated how long Tesla could hold a grudge. In 1887, Tesla found a financial backer and opened his own lab in New York. There he developed his AC motor and began building the system that would become the foundation of the modern power grid. His work caught the attention of George Westinghouse, an industrialist who looked at Tesla and saw not just an inventor, but the future. Westinghouse bought Tesla's patents and brought him on board to help launch a full-scale AC revolution. The war of the currents had officially begun, and it was about to get petty. Edison launched a smear campaign that was equal parts desperation and cartoon villainy. He told the public that AC was dangerous, that it would kill your dog, electrocute your kids, and probably explode your grandmother's teacups. In a stunningly unethical move, Edison even electrocuted animals in public using AC power just to scare people, including a freaking elephant, because nothing says, "I'm losing," like killing a zoo exhibit for PR. Tesla, meanwhile, was unbothered. He focused on refining his designs, conducting demonstrations that were not only safe but also spectacular. He would allow currents to pass through his body, lighting lamps with his hands like a walking light show. The man made electricity look cool, long before it was powering Vegas or TikTok dances. In 1893, the climax came at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Edison had been outbid, and Tesla's AC system via Westinghouse was chosen to illuminate the entire fair. It was the largest display of electric lighting the world had ever seen. Visitors stood slack-jawed beneath a canopy of artificial stars, powered by a system Edison had sworn would turn them all into roast beef. AC had officially won. Tesla had not only revolutionized electrical engineering, he defeated the most famous inventor in the world. But he wouldn't gloat, because while Edison powered cities, Tesla powered revenge, quietly, efficiently, and with alternating current. By the late 1880s, America wasn't just lighting up, it was lighting up angrily. On one side, Thomas Edison was clinging to his beloved direct current DC system like a toddler with a blankie. On the other, Nikola Tesla and industrial titan George Westinghouse were pushing for alternating current AC, a system capable of transmitting power over vast distances without setting fire to the city block every 3 feet. And so began one of the most absurdly petty and electrifying feuds in scientific history, the War of the Currents. Let's break this down like an overworked telegraph operator. DC Edison's baby could safely power homes if the generator was close enough to wave at your window. It lost voltage fast and required expensive, clunky infrastructure. To wire a city, you'd need a power station every few blocks, which was great news if you owned a copper mine, but terrible news for literally everyone else. AC, on the other hand, could step up voltage with a transformer, travel long distances, then step it down safely for home use. It was cheaper, more efficient, and much more scalable. In other words, Tesla's AC system didn't just threaten Edison's engineering pride, it threatened his entire business empire. So Edison did what any reasonable man with millions of dollars and deep insecurity would do. He tried to convince the world that AC was pure evil. How? Well, let's talk about the public executions. Edison and his team, including a man named Harold Brown, began conducting educational demonstrations in which dogs, calves, horses, and eventually an elephant named Topsy were electrocuted with AC current in front of horrified onlookers. The message? See? AC kills. DC just gives you a warm tingle and a light tan. It was dark. It was manipulative. It was weirdly theatrical. Imagine being invited to a public science fair, only to watch a goat get zapped in the name of brand loyalty. Edison even got involved in the creation of the first electric chair powered by AC, of course, to reinforce the association between alternating current and death. When William Kemmler was executed in 1890 using the device, the result was horrifyingly botched. Kemmler did not die instantly, and the gruesome scene only reinforced the public's unease, not with AC itself, but with Edison's twisted PR campaign. Meanwhile, Tesla and Westinghouse were too busy actually building the future to stop and electrocute zoo animals. Westinghouse had licensed Tesla's AC patents and funded his work on motors, generators, and large-scale systems. Tesla refined the technology with near-obsessive precision, making it safer, more efficient, and elegant in a way that bordered on poetic. The man could see electromagnetic fields in his head and build systems, as if sketching symphonies. And then came 1893, the real turning point. The organizers of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago were looking to light the entire fair, and two bids came in. Edison's camp, by now absorbed into General Electric, quoted $554,000 to power it with DC. Westinghouse, wielding Tesla's AC system, bid $399,000. Guess who won? For 6 months, visitors walked through the fairgrounds, bathed in electric light, powered by AC generators. Over 100,000 incandescent bulbs illuminated the grounds. For many attendees, it was their first experience with electricity, and Tesla made it feel like magic. His displays included demonstrations of wireless lighting, devices powered through the air, and the now famous moment where he let electricity pass through his body to light bulbs in his hands. The crowd gasped. Edison seethed. AC had arrived, but Tesla wasn't done. His biggest triumph was still ahead. In 1895, Tesla and Westinghouse completed one of the most ambitious engineering feats of the age, a hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls. For centuries, humans had looked at Niagara and thought, wow, pretty. Tesla looked and said, let's plug it in. Using the thunderous power of the falls, Tesla's system began transmitting electricity 22 miles away to Buffalo, New York. It worked flawlessly. The success made headlines worldwide. Tesla's dream of harnessing nature's power had become a reality. And it didn't involve electrocutions, guilt-tripping elephants, or frying convicts. Edison had lost. But in true Tesla fashion, the win didn't translate to wealth. Tesla had signed away his royalties on the AC patents to help Westinghouse survive financial pressure during the early rollout. A gesture of goodwill, a sacrifice for the greater cause. Also, a fantastic way to stay broke. Still, his system became the global standard. Modern civilization runs on Tesla's current, not Edison's. He hadn't just won a war. He'd laid the groundwork for every light switch, outlet, and power grid we use today. Yet even as the world basked in the glow of AC power, few understood the man behind it. Nikola Tesla was the kind of man who would stumble upon the blueprint for the future, and then hand it to someone else like a free sample at Costco. After the triumph of alternating current, Tesla could have settled into a life of well-earned luxury. AC was now the gold standard, literally lighting the world. His inventions were everywhere. His name was rising. His mustache was getting serious screen time. But when it came to making money, Tesla was as allergic to profit as he was to pearls. Let's rewind to 1890, right as things were heating up between Tesla's backer, George Westinghouse, and the financial barons of the Gilded Age. Westinghouse had sunk a fortune into Tesla's AC system. Generators, motors, licensing, wires long enough to wrap around an ego. And now the pressure was on. He owed Tesla a royalty on every kilowatt generated using AC, which, given the rapid expansion of the electrical grid, meant Tesla was about to become filthy rich. We're talking build a laboratory on the moon rich, gold-plated pigeons rich, buy Edison's house and make him pay rent rich. But Tesla, ever the idealist, took one look at Westinghouse, who was drowning in lawsuits and railroad tycoon threats, and essentially said, hey man, you okay? Want me to tear up this multi-million-dollar contract and just not be rich? And he did. Tesla voluntarily tore up the contract. He waived his future royalties, worth what would have become hundreds of millions, possibly billions today. In one moment, Tesla chose to save Westinghouse's company and ensure the survival of AC power. He sacrificed personal fortune for the success of an idea, a move so noble that even Robin Hood would have said, "Dude, at least keep lunch money." When asked about it later, Tesla shrugged it off, essentially saying, "I don't care about money, I care about progress." This is either the purest form of genius or a financial horror story worthy of its own Netflix cautionary tale. Because while the world was being rewired with Tesla's ideas, Tesla himself was slowly disconnecting from financial reality. He never had the head for business. Contracts bored him. Meetings frustrated him. He believed ideas had a kind of spiritual purity, and involving lawyers just felt like spray painting the Mona Lisa with dollar signs. Meanwhile, lesser inventors were monetizing ideas. Tesla had dreamt up in his head 5 years prior while petting a pigeon. The patent office was slow, lawsuits were everywhere, and Tesla refused to dumb down his work for the sake of investors. He didn't want to sell machines. He wanted to change the world. But without a functioning revenue model, he also had the spectacular habit of coming up with world-changing tech, then immediately getting bored with it. Invented the AC motor? Cool. Next, wireless power transmission. Moving on. Designed a bladeless turbine, earthquake machine, neon lighting, radio-controlled boats, and what might have been early wireless communication. Yes. Also yes. But did he market them? Nope. He was too busy chasing what came next, like a one-man tech company with zero brand strategy and no PR department. As the new century approached, the inventing world shifted. It was no longer enough to be a genius. You also had to be a capitalist genius. And Tesla, who refused to play the game, slowly watched the world race past him in cars running on systems he had helped build, but never owned. He moved into increasingly modest hotel rooms, racked up debts he never paid, and funded his experiments with the hope that anyone, would understand what he was trying to build. Investors came and went. Some took advantage, others just ran out of patience. Tesla, always chasing the invisible, was too advanced for the market, and too naive for the marketeers. And yet, he never really complained. He'd simply say things like, "The present is theirs. The future, for which I have really worked, is mine," which is poetic and beautiful. And also the kind of thing you say when you realize your hotel room doesn't have hot water because you owe 3 months' rent. There's a moment in every great tragedy where the hero gets everything they wanted only to give it away. This was Tesla's. He had lit up the world, but he forgot to bill it. Still, he held on to his principles. He believed that energy should be free, that power should be a right, not a privilege, sold by the volt. He envisioned wireless towers beaming electricity across the globe. He believed in unlimited energy, unlimited potential, and above all, humanity over profit. And the result? Tesla could have been a billionaire. He chose broke wizards instead. By the time the 1920s rolled around, Nikola Tesla wasn't so much the toast of the town as he was the slightly unsettling guest who never left the hotel lobby. Having traded profit for progress and fame for futuristic blueprints, Tesla began to drift from the center of scientific acclaim into the hazy margins of eccentric reclusion. He took up long-term residence in a series of increasingly modest New York hotels, most notably the Hotel New Yorker, where the management eventually just factored unpaid bills into the wallpaper. His room became part laboratory, part sanctuary, part weird bird sanctuary, because this is where the pigeons come in. Yes, pigeons. Tesla had always been a loner, but as his fame dimmed and friends disappeared, he found solace in the company of birds, and not just casually tossing crumbs like your average old man on a park bench. No, Tesla had names for them, talked to them, cared for their injuries, and by the 1930s, he was basically running a one-man avian hospital out of his hotel suite. But there was one pigeon, a white pigeon with grey-tipped wings, who became something more. Tesla didn't mince words about it. He claimed he loved her. And no, this wasn't a whimsical metaphor or a Victorian-era euphemism. He literally fell in love with a pigeon. He said, "I loved that pigeon, as a man loves a woman." To be clear, there's no evidence anything weird happened. Tesla wasn't delusional, just heartbreakingly lonely. That pigeon was his emotional support system. He said she visited him every day, and that when she died, something went out of my life. Up to that time, I knew my work was complete. It's deeply touching. Also, extremely Tesla. While Tesla was cooing to pigeons and scribbling equations for wireless energy systems, the world still wasn't ready for. His intellectual legacy was being hijacked. The most infamous theft, the radio. You've probably heard of Guglielmo Marconi, the man credited with inventing the radio. He even won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for it. Here's the twist. Marconi used 17 of Tesla's patents to make his radio work. 17. Not 1, not 2. 17. Tesla had already demonstrated radio transmission back in 1893, years before Marconi ever picked up a soldering iron. He even filed patents for it. But due to technicalities, corporate lobbying, and possibly the fact that Tesla wasn't winning and dining the patent office, Marconi got the credit, and the money, and the medal. Tesla, as usual, got pigeons. When asked about it, Tesla didn't erupt. He didn't sue, he didn't launch a petty smear campaign or electrocute a camel for attention looking at you, Edison. He simply said, Marconi is a good fellow, let him continue. He is using 17 of my patents. This was either grace in defeat, or the world's most dignified subtweet. It wasn't until 1943, just a few months after Tesla's death, that the US Supreme Court quietly reversed the decision and acknowledged that Tesla's patents predated Marconi's. But by then, Tesla was gone, and Marconi had already hosted dinners in his own honor for 3 decades. The tragedy here wasn't just the stolen credit. It was that Tesla's later years were filled with constant financial struggle. While the world enjoyed inventions built from his work, his hotel rooms were cluttered with unpaid bills, loose wires, and manuscripts for inventions no one would fund. He had ideas for wireless lighting, interplanetary communication, and particle beam weapons, but few investors, even fewer believers, and zero patience for PR nonsense. And yet, he never stopped working. Well into his 70s, Tesla filed patents, gave interviews, and sent letters to world leaders about his plans for wireless power grids and mechanical oscillators. The press, unsure whether to treat him as a genius or a walking headline, began calling him the mad scientist of Manhattan. And while he wasn't exactly helping his image with cryptic quotes and pet pigeons, the spark never left his eyes. His mind was as sharp as ever. His body, not so much. He suffered from chest pains, fainting spells, and had been hit by a taxi while crossing the street to feed birds. He refused treatment, stating his body was fine, though his medical records likely read, diagnosis, too stubborn to die. As the world entered the atomic age, Tesla, once the man who lit up cities, now lived alone, feeding birds and dreaming of towers that could power the globe. He didn't die, surrounded by accolades. He died in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker, penniless, alone, except for the pigeons that perched on the window outside. Nikola Tesla died alone, broke, and largely forgotten, in 1943. The man who imagined wireless power, radio, neon lighting, and maybe even death beams spent his final days talking to pigeons and arguing with hotel managers about unpaid room service. He wasn't exactly trending, but history, like electricity, sometimes surges back when you least expect it. For decades after his death, Tesla remained a footnote in Edison's biography, a flickering name in a few dusty textbooks. Schoolchildren learned Edison invented the light bulb, Marconi invented the radio, and Tesla, well, who's that? Maybe a vacuum brand? But as the 20th century gave way to the digital age, something strange happened. The world that Tesla had once dreamed about, full of wireless communication, remote-controlled devices and clean energy, started to look suspiciously like his notes. And suddenly, people began asking, wait a minute, didn't some tall, mustachioed weirdo think of all this first? Enter the Tesla Renaissance. Historians, tech nerds, and internet weirdos began to dig deeper. They found patents, letters, tower schematics, and tales of this strange, obsessive man who could visualize entire machines in his head and sketch electrical systems on napkins with frightening precision. The more people looked, the more they realized Tesla hadn't just been ahead of his time, he had lapped it. And then the internet, blessed chaotic internet, took over. Suddenly, Tesla was everywhere. He appeared in webcomics as the Wizard of Electricity. Memes declared him the real inventor of everything from Wi-Fi to the flux capacitor. Even Hollywood caught on. David Bowie played Tesla in the Prestige, like a stylish electrical Gandalf. Documentaries were made, biographies sold like mad, inventions once dismissed as madness were re-evaluated as visionary, but underfunded. The world had finally caught up about 70 years late, and then came the Tesla car. In the early 2000s, entrepreneur Elon Musk slapped Nikola Tesla's name on an electric car company. And suddenly, Tesla meant future again. It was ironic, really. A man who once couldn't afford a carriage ride was now the namesake of luxury vehicles that could go 0-60 in the time it took him to write down an equation. Tesla Motors may not have used Nikola's original designs, but the name was more than a nod. It was a cultural resurrection. Today we see Tesla's fingerprints everywhere. Wireless charging. Yep, Tesla had that idea before it was cool, and before phone batteries were terrible. Smart homes? He imagined centralized systems that could control lighting, temperature, and power, all from a distance. Renewable energy grids? That's essentially what he hoped to create with his Wardenclyffe Tower, minus the bankruptcy part. The man is now a pop culture folk hero, a patron saint of misunderstood geniuses, a cautionary tale and an inspiration, depending on whether you're pitching to investors or scribbling blueprints on napkins at 3 a.m. But what makes Tesla's legacy so enduring isn't just that he was smart, it's that he was uncompromisingly idealistic. He believed science should serve humanity, not just stockholders, that ideas were sacred, that energy, real energy, should be free and abundant. He lived in a world of moguls and monopolies, and decided to fight with lightning and principle. That didn't pay the bills, but it did light the path. And while he may not have lived to see his visions realized, we do. Every time you charge your phone wirelessly, drive an EV, use radio frequencies, or ignore 87 unread emails while binge-watching Wi-Fi-powered cat videos, you owe a tiny thank you to the guy who once built a remote-controlled boat just to prove it could be done. Nikola Tesla is proof that you can be broke and brilliant, lonely but legendary, and still manage to leave behind a legacy that literally powers the planet. Sure, he became famous 70 years too late to enjoy it, but hey, now he's a car, and in the end, Tesla's legacy isn't just about wires, volts, or pigeon love. It's a reminder that genius is sometimes messy, often misunderstood, and rarely profitable, but it lasts.